My son looked across the dining table we built together and told me I needed to sell my home to save him from drowning in his debt. I stayed calm, took a sip of my water, and asked him why he did not just sell his own house first. They never thought I would fight back. I am Anthony, 69 years old, and I spent my entire life working as a mechanic to build a quiet, secure life. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled the arrogance of the people I thought loved me, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who underestimated your worth. The dinner at my house was supposed to be a simple Sunday roast. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking using the recipe my late wife Diane perfected years ago. My son Jordan and his wife Megan arrived empty-handed, taking their seats at my oak dining table. I live in a neighborhood that has changed drastically over the past 2 decades. What used to be a quiet working-class area is now heavily gentrified, filled with trendy cafes and massive property taxes. My 4-bedroom house, fully paid off and sitting on a prime corner lot, is currently valued at over $800,000. Jordan pushed his plate away before he even finished his meal. He cleared his throat and looked at Megan, who gave him a sharp nod. He told me his tech startup had failed. The investors were pulling out, the creditors were calling, and he needed immediate liquidity. He did not ask for a loan. He did not ask for advice. He looked me dead in the eye and said I needed to put my house on the market immediately. He said the cash from the sale would clear his company debt and give him a fresh start. When I asked where I was supposed to live, Megan smiled tightly and said they had a finished basement in their luxury mansion where I could set up a nice little space for myself. I looked at the two of them sitting in my dining room. I looked at Jordan wearing a custom-tailored suit that he bought with borrowed money. I looked at Megan wearing diamond earrings that probably cost more than my first car. They were living in a massive 5-bedroom estate in the wealthiest suburb of the city, driving imported luxury cars and taking vacations to Europe twice a year. Yet here they were, demanding the only home I had left, the home where Diane and I raised our family, the home I worked double shifts at the garage for 30 years to pay off. I placed my fork down on the table, folding my napkin with deliberate slowness. I looked at my son and asked him a very simple question. I asked him why he did not just sell his own 5-bedroom luxury mansion to cover his debts. The question seemed to offend them deeply. Jordan scoffed, shaking his head as if I had just suggested something entirely unreasonable. He said his house was an asset, a vital part of his professional image, and that selling it would signal defeat to his peers. He actually believed his image was worth more than my reality. Then Megan leaned forward, resting her perfectly manicured hands on the table. She dropped her voice into that condescending, overly sweet tone people use when speaking to a child. She told me that I had to be practical. She said my neighborhood had become very upscale, very fast-paced, and that it was no longer suitable for a single elderly black man living all by himself. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air. She was sitting in the house I owned, eating the food I cooked, telling me I did not belong in my own community anymore because the demographics had shifted around me. She implied I was a relic, a stubborn old man occupying valuable real estate that could be better utilized to fund their reckless lifestyle. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell, scream, or throw my plate against the wall. Anger is a noisy emotion, and they did not deserve my noise. I simply stood up from my chair. I walked over to the front door, unlocked it, and pulled it wide open. The crisp evening air rushed into the hallway. I stood by the open door and looked back at the dining room. I did not say a single word. My silence was absolute and unyielding. Jordan tried to speak, tried to soften the blow with empty excuses about how they were just looking out for my best interests. I just stared at him, pointing to the exit. The heavy weight of my silence finally broke their confidence. They gathered their coats hastily, their previous arrogance replaced by a tense, uncomfortable shuffle. Megan refused to look at me as she walked out, her heels clicking aggressively against the porch steps. Jordan stopped at the threshold, opening his mouth one last time, but my eyes told him everything he needed to know. I shut the heavy wooden door firmly behind them, turning the deadbolt with a loud, satisfying click. The house felt incredibly quiet after they left. I spent the rest of the evening cleaning up the kitchen, washing the dishes by hand, and letting the warm water soothe my thoughts. I refused to let their disrespect ruin the peace I had built in this house. I slept soundly that night, convinced that my silent dismissal had set a firm boundary they would not dare to cross again. I woke up the next morning right at sunrise, my usual routine. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee, drank it on the back porch while listening to the morning birds, and made a mental list of the groceries I needed for the week. The The crisp autumn air felt refreshing. I put on my worn leather jacket, grabbed my keys from the hook by the door, and stepped out onto the front porch. I looked toward the driveway, ready to start my day. I stopped dead in my tracks. The driveway was completely empty. My heavy-duty Ford truck was gone. This was not just any vehicle. It was the truck I had bought brand new 10 years ago. The truck I maintained myself with the skills of a lifelong mechanic. The truck that held all my tools and represented my independence. I stood there staring at the empty concrete slab, my mind racing through the possibilities. I had not left the keys in the ignition. I had locked the doors. My neighborhood was safe, and car thefts were incredibly rare, especially for an older model truck tucked away behind a tall gate. A cold knot formed in my stomach as I noticed a faint set of fresh tire tracks leading out onto the street. Someone had driven it away in the dead of night. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The missing truck was not a random crime. It was a calculated move. The boundary I thought I had set the night before meant absolutely nothing to them. I reached into my pocket, my fingers wrapping tightly around my cell phone. I knew exactly what I had to do next, and I knew my life was about to change forever. This was the moment the silent correction began. They thought they could break me. They were wrong. My thumb hovered over the emergency dial button on my phone. My heart hammered a steady, angry rhythm against my ribs. I was seconds away from reporting my truck stolen when a sleek black rideshare vehicle pulled up to my curb. The back door swung open and Jordan stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive designer jacket. He looked entirely too relaxed for a man who had just stolen his father's only means of transportation. He paid the driver through an app on his phone, not even glancing in my direction until the car drove away. I lowered my phone and walked down the porch steps, my eyes locked on his smug face. I asked him where my truck was. He offered a practiced, patronizing sigh, the kind of sigh a tired parent gives a misbehaving toddler. He casually slipped his hands into his pockets and told me he had taken the liberty of driving my truck to a wholesale dealership early this morning. He said he was just looking out for my safety. He claimed that I was getting too old, too confused, and too unpredictable to be operating a heavy vehicle on public roads. He actually had the nerve to stand in my driveway, breathing the morning air, and tell me that my reflexes were fading. He said he was protecting me from myself. He said the dealership was currently appraising the truck and that he would hold on to the cash from the sale to ensure I did not lose it or spend it foolishly. He spoke with such chilling ease, acting as if Grand Theft Auto was simply a responsible family intervention. He was trying to gaslight a man who had rebuilt engines blindfolded. He wanted me to explode. He wanted me to scream, to throw a punch, to call the police while he played the role of the concerned, level-headed son, dealing with a senile, combative father. He was practically begging for a loud, violent, and very messy reaction that he could quickly use against me in a local court of civil law today. I did not give him the satisfaction of an outburst. I stared at him with cold calculation. My mind immediately shifted from anger to absolute clarity. The physical theft of my old work truck was annoying, but it was far too sloppy for a man like Jordan, who meticulously curated every detail of his life. He was a desperate man drowning in corporate debt. Selling a 10-year-old vehicle at a wholesale lot would barely fetch enough cash to cover a month of his mortgage payments, let alone bail out a failing tech startup. The math did not add up. This elaborate morning performance, the patronizing speech about my mental decline, and the grand gesture of taking my keys were nothing but a smokescreen. He was intentionally creating a highly visible, emotionally exhausting conflict to keep my attention focused on the missing vehicle. He wanted me pacing the driveway, arguing with him and waiting for police officers to arrive and take an official statement. He needed me distracted. I realized instantly that while I was standing here debating the whereabouts of a piece of metal, his real attack was happening somewhere else. I turned my back on him in mid-sentence. His voice trailed off, clearly confused by my lack of resistance. He demanded to know where I was going, but I completely ignored him. I walked straight past him, marching down the sidewalk at a brisk, purposeful pace. Without my truck, my mobility was temporarily crippled. I needed to reach my attorney, Jonathan Kaplan, a man known for being a ruthless legal predator who destroyed corporate fraudsters for a living. His office was located downtown, over 12 miles away. I did not have a rideshare application on my phone, and public transportation from my neighborhood would take hours I could not afford to waste. I needed physical cash to hail a taxi from the main commercial boulevard located a few blocks away from my house. The autumn wind bit at my face as I walked, my boots striking this pavement with deliberate force. I felt a strange sense of calm washing over me. The emotional bond I had spent decades trying to nurture with my son had effectively snapped, replaced by the sharp instincts of a survivor protecting his territory. I reached the glass double doors of my local community bank branch just as the security guard was unlocking them for the morning rush. The familiar chime of the entrance bell signaled my arrival. I stepped into the warm lobby, bypassed the long line forming at the automated teller machines, and walked directly toward the main teller counter. I needed a significant withdrawal to cover emergency legal retainers' transportation and immediate living expenses while I sorted out this absolute nightmare. I approached the teller window and smiled politely at the young woman behind the thick glass. I slid my personal identification card and my debit card under the metal slot, casually requesting a substantial cash withdrawal from my primary emergency savings account. I stood there in the quiet lobby, mentally preparing myself for the brutal legal war I was about to unleash upon my own deeply misguided child. I was completely unaware that the first devastating financial blow had already been struck against me while I was sleeping. The young teller, a woman named Sarah, whom I had known since she started working there 5 years ago, took my identification card and began typing on her keyboard. Her cheerful morning smile slowly faded as she stared at the computer monitor. A deep, uncomfortable frown creased her forehead. She clicked her mouse a few more times, her eyes darting between the screen and my face with an expression of profound, agonizing pity. I felt the air in my lungs turn to ice. I asked her if there was a problem with the system. She hesitated, lowering her voice to a sympathetic whisper, and asked me to confirm the specific account I was trying to access. I clearly stated it was my primary emergency fund. It was a joint account I had established a decade ago, mere weeks after my beloved wife Diane passed away from a sudden illness. I had added Jordan's name to that specific account solely as a protective measure, ensuring he would have immediate access to funds to cover my funeral expenses in case something tragic ever happened to me unexpectedly. For 10 years, that account had sat completely untouched, gathering interest, acting as a silent safety net for my final days. Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned the computer monitor slightly toward the thick glass window. She looked me directly in the eyes and delivered the crushing news. The account was completely empty. Every single penny was gone. She informed me that late last night, right around midnight, Jordan had initiated a massive authorized wire transfer. He had systematically drained the entire balance of exactly $40,000, funneling the money directly into his own private offshore corporate account. I stood absolutely frozen in the bank lobby, the devastating reality crashing down upon me. The stolen truck was not just a distraction to keep me busy. It was a calculated, malicious strategy to prevent me from driving to the bank and discovering his massive financial betrayal before the morning wire transfer fully cleared. He had effectively left me completely stranded, mercilessly robbed, and entirely without any usable cash. My own flesh and blood son had just brutally and financially gutted me, proving my silent war had officially begun today. I left the bank with nothing but a printed receipt of my zero balance. The walk to the main commercial boulevard felt different this time. The cold autumn wind was no longer a nuisance, but a sharp reminder of the ruthless war I was now fighting. I managed to hail a passing cab using the last bit of emergency physical cash I kept tucked inside my leather wallet. As the taxi pulled up to my curb and drove away, I noticed an unfamiliar gray sedan parked directly in front of my gate. I walked up my concrete driveway, unlocked my heavy wooden door, and stepped into my hallway. The smell of cheap, overpowering cologne immediately hit my nose. I walked into my living room and stopped dead in my tracks. A middle-aged white man in a poorly fitted tan suit was sitting comfortably on my vintage sofa. He was holding a medical clipboard and casually flipping through a stack of printed papers. He looked up at me, offered a practiced, sympathetic smile, and stood up to greet me. He introduced himself as Dr. Harrison, claiming he was an independent cognitive behavioral specialist. He confidently stated that my daughter-in-law Megan had expressed deep, urgent medical concerns about my rapidly deteriorating mental state. She had given him a spare house key, which Jordan must have secretly stolen from my missing truck, and authorized him to conduct an immediate in-home evaluation to determine if I was still fit to manage my own personal affairs. The strategy was crystal clear. They were not just trying to forcefully take my house and steal my money. They were actively trying to strip away my legal autonomy. They wanted a medical professional to declare me legally incompetent so they could seize complete power of attorney over my entire life. Dr. Harrison gestured condescendingly for me to sit down, clicking his pen ready to administer a memory test that was specifically designed for me to fail. The sheer arrogance of this home invasion was absolutely breathtaking. I looked at this stranger sitting in my house. I did not take the seat he offered me. Instead, I calmly reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and openly activated the voice recording application. I placed the phone gently on the glass coffee table between us, making sure the red recording light was clearly visible. Dr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, his fake smile faltering for a brief second. He arrogantly told me that recording the private session was highly unusual and strictly against standard medical protocol. I completely ignored his protest and immediately began my own aggressive evaluation. I asked him to clearly state his full legal name, his official state medical license number, and the specific psychiatric board that certified his practice. He stammered, pathetically falsely claiming he did not need to provide that information to a patient under severe emotional distress. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I sternly informed him that any legitimate medical professional operating in this state is legally required to provide credential verification upon immediate request. I asked him again fiercely, demanding the exact name of his supervising medical clinic. He adjusted his tie nervously, anxiously glancing toward the front door. The truth was glaringly obvious. This man was not a licensed doctor. He was a paid actor, a shady consultant, or perhaps just a desperate friend of Megan willing to forge a medical document for a quick cash payout. I leaned over him, my physical presence completely dominating the small space. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to pick up his clipboard and walk out of my house before I locked the front door, called the police, and pressed felony charges for breaking and entering, impersonating a medical professional, and criminal conspiracy to commit elder fraud. His face turned completely pale. The professional facade shattered instantly. He did not say another single word. He hastily scooped up his papers, nearly tripping over the living room rug, and practically sprinted out the front door. I watched his sedan speed away down the street before I firmly locked the door behind him. I picked up my phone and requested a premium rideshare service using the emergency credit card linked directly to my secure digital wallet. I could no longer play defense. I had to strike back hard and fast. 20 minutes later, I was sitting inside the immaculate glass-walled office of Jonathan Kaplan. Jonathan was a ruthless shark in a tailored suit possessing a lethal combination of brilliant legal strategy and absolute fearlessness. I laid out everything that had happened over the past 24 hours. I told him about the stolen truck, the drained bank account, and the fake doctor. Jonathan did not offer any empty sympathy. He simply nodded, his fingers flying across his computer keyboard as he began rapidly pulling up public financial records and property deeds linked to my name and my son. He told me that Jordan and Megan were moving with the chaotic speed of panicked people. He explained that stealing $40,000 and trying to fake a medical competency evaluation were extreme criminal measures, strongly indicating they were trying to cover up a much larger, more catastrophic crime. The room fell perfectly silent except for the rapid clicking of his keyboard. Then Jonathan suddenly stopped typing. Jonathan leaned back in his expensive leather executive chair, slowly taking off his reading glasses. He stared at the computer monitor with an expression of pure disgust. He turned the large screen toward me so I could clearly see the legally binding documents. He took a deep breath and dropped a devastating bombshell that made the stolen money and the missing truck look like minor inconveniences. He revealed that Jordan did not just steal my physical property or drain my liquid cash reserves. My son had crossed a strict legal line that carried severe federal prison time. Jonathan pointed to a scanned document with my name printed at the bottom. It was an official mortgage agreement. Jordan had acquired a shadowy, high-interest, unregulated loan from a predatory private lending firm to inject cash into his failing technology business. The loan was massive, easily exceeding $500,000. Because his own assets were likely already fully leveraged or hopelessly underwater, the private lenders had demanded absolute unencumbered collateral to secure the money. Jordan had used my fully paid-off house. He had illegally submitted my property as the sole collateral for his desperate business loan. Jonathan zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the digital document. There, written in blue ink, was my exact name. The handwriting looked vaguely similar to mine, but the sharp angles and inconsistent pressure points made the brutal truth undeniable. Jordan had blatantly forged my signature on a binding federal financial document. He had legally tied the fate of my home to his doomed company. If his startup defaulted on this predatory loan, which was almost a mathematical certainty at this point, the aggressive private lenders had the legal right to seize my property and throw me out onto the street. The fake doctor visit suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. If they could successfully declare me mentally incompetent today, I would never be able to legally contest the forged signature on the mortgage documents tomorrow. They were trying to silence me legally before the devastating financial hammer fell. I stared at the forged signature, feeling a cold, calculating rage replacing my shock. I looked up at Jonathan, my voice completely steady. I told him to prepare for absolute war. I walked out of Jonathan Kaplan's office with a crisp copy of the forged shadow loan folded neatly in my jacket pocket. The cold rage that had settled in my chest was no longer a burden. It was a precise, highly focused weapon. I pulled out my phone and ordered another premium car service, typing in the address of the Whispering Pines Country Club. It was an ultra-exclusive, predominantly white establishment nestled in the wealthiest zip code of the county. Megan practically lived there. She spent her weekends sipping overpriced champagne on the manicured terraces, treating the staff like indentured servants, and parading her false wealth to anyone who would look. I arrived at the grand iron gates 20 minutes later. The uniformed valet rushed forward to open my car door, momentarily confused by my presence before his training kicked in. I did not pause to answer his greeting. I walked straight up the wide marble steps and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the main clubhouse. The lobby was a massive expanse of polished oak crystal chandeliers and muted conversations. A hostess at the front desk opened her mouth to ask for my membership card, but I walked past her with such absolute, unwavering authority that she instinctively stepped back. I knew exactly where Megan would be. The dining terrace overlooking the 18th hole was her designated stage. I stepped out onto the sunlit patio. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh-cut grass. There were dozens of tables filled with wealthy patrons, but I spotted her immediately. Megan was sitting at the center of a large table, surrounded by 5 of her affluent friends. She was wearing a white silk dress, throwing her head back in exaggerated laughter while a waiter nervously refilled her tall mimosa glass. She looked completely carefree, entirely convinced that her husband had successfully neutralized me. She was utterly unaware that I was standing just a few short feet away from her chair, holding the very document that would permanently dismantle her perfect and highly fraudulent little life right here today. I did not make a scene. I did not storm over to her table, waving my arms or shouting accusations. That is what they expected from me. That is the stereotypical reaction they wanted, so they could dismiss me as an unstable, aggressive man who could not handle his emotions. Instead, I moved through the dining terrace with absolute silence and measured precision. The wealthy patrons around me barely registered my presence. I simply walked up behind Megan and stopped right at the edge of her large, crowded table. Her friends were busy talking about an upcoming charity gala, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of privilege. Megan picked up her mimosa glass, preparing to take another sip while she laughed at a joke I did not care to hear. I reached into my jacket pocket and smoothly pulled out the perfectly folded copy of the shadow loan contract. Without saying a word to announce my arrival, I leaned forward and gently slid the thick piece of paper directly onto the white linen tablecloth, slipping it right under the base of her wet mimosa glass. The sudden movement caught her eye. She stopped laughing instantly. Her manicured fingers froze halfway to her mouth. She looked down at the table, clearly annoyed that someone had interrupted her brunch. Then her eyes locked onto the black ink printing on the paper. I watched the color rapidly drain from her face. She recognized the legal formatting immediately. She recognized the name of the predatory private lending firm printed boldly at the top of the page. Most importantly, she recognized her own forged signature resting right next to the horrific forgery of my own name at the bottom of the document. She knew exactly what Jordan had done, and her name was permanently tied to the federal crime. The silence at the table was immediate and absolute. Her 5 affluent friends stopped talking, sensing the sudden, drastic shift in the atmosphere. They looked at me, their faces twisting into expressions of confusion and mild disgust, wondering who this older black man was and why he was standing so close to their private gathering. I leaned down slowly, bringing my face just inches away from her ear. The scent of her expensive perfume was suffocating, but I did not pull back. I kept my own voice incredibly low, ensuring that only she could hear the absolute finality in my words. I whispered that her forged signature was as cheap as her character. I told her that stealing my truck was a pathetic distraction, but forging federal financial documents was a mandatory prison sentence. I watched her breath hitch in her throat. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the mimosa glass rattled against the table. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of pure terror and undeniable guilt. She was entirely exposed. The facade of her perfect, wealthy existence had just been shattered by a single piece of paper. She tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing silently, but no words came out. I stood up straight, adjusting my jacket, completely unbothered by the sheer panic radiating from her. I had delivered the message. I turned around and began to walk away, fully intending to leave the club. But Megan could not let me walk away. Her entire social standing was built on the perception of absolute control, and I had just stripped that away in front of her most important peers. Her fear instantly mutated into a vicious, desperate defense mechanism. She slammed her hands flat against the table, intentionally knocking over her mimosa glass. The orange liquid spilled across the white linen, dripping onto the pristine terrace floor. She jumped up from her chair, pointing a trembling finger directly at my back. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and completely devoid of its usual refined elegance. She yelled for the staff, loudly claiming that a deranged homeless man was harassing her and threatening her life. She shouted that I did not belong there, aggressively weaponizing her privilege to turn the entire dining terrace against me. Conversations stopped immediately. The clinking of silverware ceased. Dozens of wealthy patrons turned to stare at me, their faces hardening with collective suspicion and prejudice based entirely on her hysterical accusation. Megan continued to scream, clutching her chest and playing the role of the terrified victim flawlessly. Her friends quickly rallied around her, glaring at me as if I were a dangerous criminal who had just crawled over their exclusive gated walls. Within seconds, the heavy wooden doors of the clubhouse swung open violently. Two massive, broad-shouldered security guards rushed out onto the terrace. They were wearing dark uniforms and carrying heavy batons strapped tightly to their hips. They did not pause to assess the situation or ask for my side of the story. They took one look at the crying white woman and the older black man standing near her table, and their training immediately dictated their response. They charged directly toward me, their faces set in aggressive, uncompromising scowls. They slowly raised their heavy batons, fully expecting me to cower in fear or frantically attempt to run away. The larger guard barked a harsh command, ordering me to get down on the ground with my hands behind my back. They were fully prepared to physically tackle me to the stone floor, completely unaware that laying a single finger on me would be the absolute worst mistake of their entire professional careers. The heavy hands of the security guards clamped down on my shoulders with the brutal force of men accustomed to unquestioned authority. Their fingers dug deeply into the fabric of my jacket, violently twisting my arms behind my back in a standard restraint technique. The larger guard pressed his solid weight against my spine, aggressively forcing me to bow my head toward the polished stone floor of the terrace. He growled a harsh command directly into my ear, ordering me to stop resisting, even though I had not moved a single muscle in protest. I stood perfectly still, allowing them to apply their physical pressure, my expression remaining completely unreadable. Across the table, Megan was practically glowing with a perverse sense of triumph. A wide, malevolent smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my public humiliation. This was exactly what she wanted. She wanted her wealthy, privileged friends to see me as nothing more than a dangerous, unruly outsider who had to be physically subdued and dragged away from their pristine sanctuary. Her 5 affluent companions mirrored her smug satisfaction, whispering quietly among themselves, casting disgusted glances in my direction. They were entirely comfortable watching an older black man being manhandled by aggressive security personnel in the middle of their exclusive brunch. The entire dining terrace had fallen into a heavy, judgmental silence. Dozens of eyes burned into my back. Megan looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. She actually believed she had won. She believed that her loud voice and her strategic white tears had successfully neutralized the devastating threat I had just placed underneath her mimosa glass. She took a slow, deliberate sip from a fresh glass of water, locking eyes with me, silently communicating that I was entirely powerless in her world. She was absolutely certain that I would be thrown out into the street like common trash, permanently banned from the premises and completely discredited before I could ever expose her federal crime. I did not struggle against the heavy grip of the 2 security guards. Instead, I spoke with a voice so profoundly calm and authoritative that it caused the larger guard to momentarily loosen his hold. I clearly instructed him to reach into the inner left breast pocket of my tailored jacket. I explicitly told him that he would find my state identification card and a very specific legal document that he desperately needed to read before he made the worst mistake of his professional life. The guard hesitated, glancing nervously toward Megan, who immediately shrieked that I was probably reaching for a weapon. I kept my hands entirely visible, firmly repeating my instruction to the guard. Reluctantly, the smaller guard reached into my pocket and pulled out my leather wallet along with a thick, folded piece of parchment paper. He flipped open my wallet, glancing at my driver license, and then carefully unfolded the parchment. As his eyes scanned the heavy black text and the official gold seal stamped at the bottom of the page, all the aggressive tension instantly drained from his rigid posture. He swallowed hard, his face turning an alarming shade of pale white. He rapidly tapped his partner on the shoulder, frantically shoving the document into his hands. Decades ago, long before this manicured golf course existed, this entire area was nothing but cheap, undeveloped brushland. Working double shifts as a mechanic, I had saved every spare dollar to quietly purchase massive plots of this seemingly worthless real estate under the corporate umbrella of Oak Ridge Investment, LLC. When the wealthy developers finally arrived to build this exclusive country club, I absolutely refused to sell. Instead, I forced them into an ironclad permanent lease agreement. My company legally owned 30% of the very ground these arrogant people were currently standing on. I was not a trespassing vagrant. I was their landlord. The sudden sound of frantic running footsteps echoed across the silent terrace. The general manager of the country club, a man in a sharp suit who had been urgently alerted to the commotion, burst through the clubhouse doors. He took one horrified look at the unfolding scene, his eyes locking onto my face, and he practically sprinted across the patio. He violently shoved his own security guards away from me, screaming at them to step back immediately. The manager was breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead as he frantically smoothed the wrinkles on my jacket lapel. He bowed his head repeatedly, his voice trembling with genuine terror as he apologized for the unforgivable misunderstanding. He loudly addressed me as Mr. Hayes, respectfully acknowledging my status as the primary stakeholder of the land. The collective gasp from Megan and her 5 affluent friends was absolute music to my ears. Megan's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer uncomprehending horror. Her friends physically recoiled from her, pushing their chairs back completely, shocked that they were sitting with a woman who had just falsely accused the multi-million-dollar landowner of being a homeless threat. The manager turned his furious gaze directly toward Megan. He coldly informed her that her behavior was a severe violation of the club's code of conduct and immediately demanded that she and her guests vacate the premises. Megan sat there entirely paralyzed, her face burning with the ultimate public humiliation. I smoothly took my documents back from the terrified guard, adjusted my cuffs, and walked away from the table without giving her a second glance. I left the Whispering Pines Country Club through the front doors the exact same way I had entered. The valet practically tripped over his own feet, rushing to open the door of my waiting rideshare vehicle. I sat in the quiet comfort of the back seat as the car navigated away from the manicured lawns and towering gates of the elite neighborhood. I watched the scenery blur past my window, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction settling deeply into my bones. I had successfully shattered the fragile, arrogant illusion Megan used to shield herself from the consequences of her own actions. I returned to my empty house, locked the heavy wooden door, and spent the remainder of the afternoon systematically reviewing the financial documents Jonathan Kaplan had provided. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across my living room floor. I did not bother turning on the lights. I simply sat in my favorite armchair, waiting for the inevitable retaliation. I knew Jordan would not accept defeat gracefully. His entire world was crumbling, and desperate men always double down on their worst mistakes. Right at 9 o'clock, my cell phone shattered the silence of the dark room. The caller identification displayed Jordan's name. I answered the call, bringing the phone slowly to my ear without speaking a single word. Jordan did not wait for a greeting. His voice exploded through the speaker, vibrating with an unhinged, frantic rage. He screamed that I had intentionally embarrassed his wife in front of the most important people in her social circle. He completely ignored the fact that she had forged my signature to steal a massive shadow loan. He only cared about the superficial damage to their precious public image. He was breathing heavily, his words slurring slightly, as if he had been drinking heavily to cope with the disastrous events of the day. He coldly told me that my little stunt at the country club had sealed my fate. He confidently declared that the appraisers were coming to my house first thing tomorrow morning. He dropped his final venomous threat before ending the call. He said they had already secured an emergency court order from a sympathetic judge to forcefully move me into an assisted living facility by the end of the week. The morning sun had barely breached the horizon when the aggressive rumble of heavy diesel engines shattered the quiet of my neighborhood. I was already dressed and fully prepared. I stood by the front window, peering through the slight gap in the heavy curtains. A massive white moving truck parked illegally across my driveway, followed closely by a sleek silver sedan. 4 large men wearing matching moving company uniforms stepped out of the truck, stretching their thick arms and pulling on heavy work gloves. Jordan stepped out of the sedan, holding a thick folder of printed papers. He marched toward my front gate with the misplaced confidence of a man who believed a fabricated court order could magically erase my entire existence. He did not come alone today. 2 professionally dressed individuals, clearly the property appraisers he had threatened me with, trailed closely behind him, carrying digital tablets and expensive measuring equipment. Jordan reached the wrought iron gate that secured the perimeter of my yard. He confidently pushed the heavy metal latch, expecting it to swing open and grant him the absolute authority to invade my sanctuary. The gate did not move a single inch. He rattled it violently, the metal clanging loudly against the thick stone pillars. He stepped back, his face twisting in sudden frustration, and aggressively yelled my name toward the house. He ordered the moving crew to find a way over the tall fence, loudly declaring that he had a judge's signature authorizing the immediate clearing of the entire property. The hired movers exchanged hesitant glances, clearly uncomfortable with the highly aggressive instructions. But they slowly began to approach the perimeter. Jordan pounded his fist against the iron bars, fiercely demanding that I come out and surrender the keys. He shouted that the medical transport van was already on its way to forcefully relocate me to the assisted living facility. He desperately wanted to strip away my dignity right there on the front lawn in full view of the neighborhood. He truly thought that he had completely cornered me in this very specific final standoff today. I opened the heavy oak front door and stepped out onto my wide wooden porch. I was not holding a packed suitcase or trembling in fear. Instead, I held a freshly brewed mug of black coffee, the steam rising gently into the crisp morning air. I casually sat down on my favorite rocking chair, took a slow sip, and watched his pathetic performance unfold. I had not been idle during the long night. Right after his frantic phone call, I had hired a premium security firm. Every single entrance to my home was now fortified with military-grade smart locks that could only be accessed through my personal biometric data. Furthermore, multiple high-definition hidden cameras were strategically installed across the roofline and perfectly positioned in the surrounding trees. Every threat Jordan shouted, every aggressive strike against my gate, and every loud demand to illegally seize my property was currently being recorded in crystal-clear audio and video. Jordan saw me sitting calmly on the porch, and his anger instantly boiled over. He screamed that I was being completely irrational, waving the folder of papers in the air. He commanded the moving crew to break the iron lock, promising to double their hourly pay if they forced their way inside immediately. The lead mover grabbed a heavy crowbar from the truck, finally succumbing to the financial bribe. He took 2 steps toward my gate, raising the steel tool into the air. He never got the chance to swing it. The wail of police sirens suddenly pierced the morning air, rapidly growing louder. A black county sheriff cruiser sped around the street corner, its bright red and blue lights flashing brilliantly against the surrounding houses. Right behind the cruiser was the familiar, imposing black luxury vehicle belonging to Jonathan Kaplan. Both cars abruptly stopped directly behind the moving truck, effectively blocking their only escape route. The lead mover dropped his crowbar, instantly raising his empty hands in the air as a uniformed sheriff deputy stepped out of the cruiser. Jonathan exited his vehicle, adjusting his expensive tie, looking like a predator perfectly cornering his prey. He walked straight past the confused appraisers and the terrified moving crew, heading directly toward Jordan. Jordan stood frozen, the color completely draining from his face as the sheriff deputy stood right beside my lawyer. Jonathan did not waste time with pleasantries. He loudly announced himself as my legal counsel and forcefully slapped a thick legal document directly against Jordan's chest. Jonathan explicitly informed him that he had just been officially served with a highly restrictive emergency restraining order signed by a superior court judge. The order legally prohibited Jordan from coming within 500 feet of me or my property due to documented severe elder abuse, extreme harassment, and an active federal investigation into deeply fraudulent financial documents. Jonathan loudly warned the moving crew and the appraisers that if they took one more step toward my gate, They would be immediately arrested and prosecuted as active accessories to a severe felony crime. The moving crew did not need to hear another single word. Absolute panic set in. They sprinted back to their truck in complete terror, desperately rushing to abandon Jordan standing utterly alone on the cold concrete sidewalk while the shocked neighborhood watched everything. The massive moving truck rapidly reversed down the street, its gears grinding violently as the driver desperately tried to flee the active scene. The two property appraisers silently slipped into their vehicle and drove away just as quickly, terrified of being implicated in a federal investigation. Jordan was left completely isolated on the sidewalk, holding the emergency restraining order with visibly shaking hands. The sheriff deputy sternly pointed toward Jordan's sedan, officially instructing him to vacate the premises immediately or face immediate incarceration. Defeated, utterly humiliated, and entirely stripped of his false power, Jordan slowly walked back to his car and drove away without looking back. The immediate physical threat was finally gone. I walked down the porch steps and unlocked the heavy iron gate to let Jonathan inside. I expected to see a triumphant smile on his face, but his expression was incredibly grim. He did not celebrate our victory over the trespassing crew. Instead, he reached inside his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, certified envelope bearing the unmistakable, terrifying seal of the Internal Revenue Service. He handed the heavy letter to me with a deep sigh. He explained that he had discovered a horrifying new layer to Jordan's financial crimes while diving deeper into the background of the predatory private lending firm. The shadow loan Jordan acquired using my forged signature was not just a terrible business decision. It was a massive illegal mechanism designed specifically to shelter stolen corporate funds and aggressively evade federal taxation. By illegally tying my property to that specific loan, Jordan had unknowingly dragged my primary residence into the very center of a massive tax evasion scandal. I carefully tore open the certified envelope and slowly unfolded the rigid paper inside. The printed words practically burned my eyes as I read. The federal government considered my fully paid-off home to be an active, illegally acquired financial asset utilized to facilitate massive corporate tax fraud. The bold letters at the bottom of the official notice delivered a truly devastating blow. The Internal Revenue Service officially stated that unless the entire massive fraudulent balance was fully resolved immediately, they would legally initiate a complete federal seizure of my beloved home in exactly 7 days, stripping away absolutely everything I owned. Jonathan left me standing in my hallway holding the certified letter from the Internal Revenue Service. 7 days. That was the exact amount of time I had before the federal government would completely seize my property, forcefully evict me, and auction off my home to cover the massive tax evasion debt Jordan had illegally attached to my name. The ticking clock had officially started. Most people would panic. Most elderly men facing the combined wrath of an aggressive federal tax agency and a ruthless private lending firm would simply collapse under the sheer weight of the impending destruction. I did not panic. I carefully placed the terrifying federal notice on my kitchen counter, smoothing out the creased edges with deliberate precision. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a heavy metal flashlight. I opened the narrow door leading down into my basement and slowly descended the wooden stairs. The air down here was thick with dust and the familiar smell of old engine oil from my early mechanic days. I navigated through the dim light, stepping past stacks of cardboard boxes filled with old family photographs, discarded tools, and forgotten winter clothes. Tucked away in the furthest, darkest corner of the basement, completely hidden behind a massive stack of old truck tires, sat a heavy fireproof floor safe. It was a solid steel vault weighing over 800 pounds bolted directly into the thick concrete foundation of the house. I had not touched this safe since the month after my wife Diane passed away. I knelt on the cold concrete floor and wiped a thick layer of gray dust off the heavy brass dial. My fingers remembered the complex numerical combination perfectly. I spun the dial to the left, then to the right, and then to the left again, carefully listening for the heavy internal tumblers to fall into place. The final loud click echoed sharply through the quiet basement. I grabbed the cold steel handle and pulled the heavy door open. The thick metal hinges groaned loudly in protest. Inside the dark vault rested my absolute ultimate defense against total ruin. It was finally time to show my arrogant son what real financial power actually looked like. I reached deep into the dark cavity of the steel safe and pulled out a massive black leather binder. The gold embossed lettering on the spine read, Oak Ridge Investment, LLC. I carried the heavy binder upstairs, set it down on my dining room table, and opened it. The pages inside represented the absolute smartest decisions I had ever made in my entire life. 15 years ago, long before the neighborhood gentrified and long before Jordan started pretending to be a wealthy corporate titan, I realized that working as a mechanic would never generate true generational wealth. I needed a silent, invisible vehicle to build and protect my assets. With Diane's blessing and strict financial discipline, I quietly established Oak Ridge Investment LLC. I used the company as a corporate shell to aggressively purchase undervalued commercial real estate, secure lucrative ground leases, and strategically invest in high-yield private debt. Jordan always thought we were just a modest, working-class family scraping by on an hourly wage. He never bothered to ask how I managed to pay off this house so quickly, or how I afforded Diane's expensive medical care during her final years. He simply assumed I was lucky. He never knew that while he was busy buying flashy designer clothes on credit to impress his college friends, I was quietly building a multi-million-dollar private equity firm from my greasy garage. Oak Ridge grew massively over the decade, entirely hidden behind layers of strict corporate confidentiality. Only Jonathan Kaplan and I knew the true identity of the primary shareholder. 5 years ago, Jordan and Megan faced their first major financial crisis. They had wildly overextended themselves, purchasing their massive luxury mansion, and were on the absolute brink of total foreclosure. They begged the banks for mercy, but their credit was completely destroyed. In a desperate move to save them without enabling their reckless spending habits, I directed Oak Ridge Investment LLC to secretly purchase their distressed mortgage debt directly from their original bank at a steep discount. I became their sole mortgage holder. Jordan and Megan were absolutely thrilled when an anonymous corporate entity restructured their massive loan, foolishly believing they had successfully outsmarted the financial system. They gleefully signed the new binding mortgage contract with Oak Ridge, completely unaware that the faceless corporate predator holding the absolute legal right to their spectacular home was actually sitting across from them at Thanksgiving dinner. The contract contained a very specific, incredibly strict hidden penalty clause regarding continuous timely payments and mandatory property tax compliance. They had to pay Oak Ridge promptly on the first day of every single month without exception. If they missed a single payment, or if they violated any financial regulations, the corporate entity had the absolute legal right to instantly trigger a total default and seize the property without any prolonged judicial review. I slowly turned the crisp pages of the heavy binder until I found the original fully executed mortgage contract bearing both of their arrogant signatures. I ran my finger over the strict default clause. I knew for an absolute fact that Jordan was completely broke. He had drained my emergency savings account and forged a shadow loan just to keep his failing startup afloat. There was absolutely no way he had made his required monthly mortgage payment to Oak Ridge this morning. I picked up my smartphone from the dining room table and immediately dialed Jonathan Kaplan's private office number. He answered on the first ring, his voice tight with concern over the impending Internal Revenue Service deadline. He quickly started suggesting various defensive legal maneuvers we could attempt to delay the federal seizure of my house. I cut him off mid-sentence. I did not want to play defense anymore. I told him to completely stop worrying about the aggressive federal tax agents for right now because I was about to completely eradicate the root of the problem. I stared down at the signed mortgage contract in the black leather binder. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound sense of absolute finality wash over me. I spoke into the phone with a voice as cold and hard as the steel safe in my basement. I instructed Jonathan to immediately log into the secure Oak Ridge investment banking portal and officially verify the incoming payment ledger. Jonathan paused, confused by the sudden shift in strategy, but I heard the rapid clicking of his keyboard through the speaker. A few seconds later, he confirmed exactly what I already knew. Jordan and Megan had officially missed their mandatory first-of-the-month mortgage payment. They were entirely in breach of their strict contract. I smiled a tight, humorless expression. I clearly and firmly ordered Jonathan to instantly trigger the absolute default clause for Oak Ridge Investment LLC. I told him that Jordan and Megan had officially missed their hidden clause payment today, thereby voiding all previous protections. They had tried to steal my only home and throw me out onto the street just to cover their own pathetic mistakes. They had attacked my sanity, stolen my money, and weaponized the federal government against me. It was time to return the exact same favor. I instructed Jonathan to quickly draft the immediate foreclosure documents and send the official process server out directly today. It is finally time to legally take their beautiful luxury mansion away from them completely. They will learn a brutally painful lesson about respect this evening. 5 years ago, when Oak Ridge Investment LLC formally acquired their highly distressed debt from a major national bank, Jordan and Megan actually threw a lavish party to celebrate. They genuinely believed they had successfully outsmarted the traditional banking system by being transferred to a faceless corporate entity that merely sent automated monthly statements to their email. They never bothered to hire a financial advisor to research the true origins of Oak Ridge. They simply set up a standard automated bank transfer and immediately continued their recklessly lavish lifestyle, fully convinced that sluggish corporate bureaucracy would protect them from any sudden financial consequences. Today, having brutally drained my emergency savings account and believing they had successfully secured a massive shadow loan to artificially save Jordan's failing technology startup, they felt absolutely invincible. They arrogantly assumed that missing their mandatory first-of-the-month mortgage payment would just generate a generic late fee notice in the mail a few weeks from now. They were completely unaware that the ruthless chief executive officer of Oak Ridge was the exact same man they had just tried to forcefully evict from his own home earlier this morning. They thought massive corporate predators moved slowly. They did not understand that I was not a distant, indifferent board of directors. I was a deeply betrayed father who had just been aggressively pushed past the absolute point of no return. I had explicitly instructed my attorney, Jonathan Kaplan, to bypass all standard courtesy warnings and typical grace periods. There would be no automated warning emails. There would be no polite phone calls from a customer service representative offering a payment plan. The strict default clause written into their specific contract was a zero-tolerance legal trigger. Once the strict payment deadline passed at exactly noon today, the aggressive legal machinery engaged with terrifying speed. Jonathan utilized a premium, highly expedited legal processing service, ensuring that the initial foreclosure documents were formally filed, officially stamped by a superior court judge, and handed directly to a private process server before the sun even began to set. Jordan and Megan had spent the entire afternoon celebrating what they thought was their ultimate victory over me, completely oblivious to the massive legal missile currently locked onto their front door. Later that very same cold evening, Megan was hosting one of her signature luxury dinner parties at the mansion. She had hired a premium private chef to prepare a 5-course meal, pouring expensive vintage wine and laughing loudly to project an image of absolute perfection and unshakable wealth. Jordan proudly sat at the head of the long table wearing a freshly pressed designer suit, confidently telling his affluent guests exaggerated stories about his upcoming technology ventures. He acted as if the morning confrontation at my front gate and the terrifying federal tax investigation simply did not exist. They were actively living inside a magnificent delusion, insulated by the thick, soundproof walls of their massive 5-bedroom estate. Their false reality was violently shattered right in the middle of their main course. The heavy brass knocker on their $10,000 custom oak front door slammed loudly, echoing through the grand foyer and completely silencing the lively dinner conversation. Jordan frowned, clearly annoyed by the unexpected interruption, and signaled for his hired domestic staff to ignore it. But the knocking did not stop. It escalated into aggressive, rhythmic pounding. The private process server Jonathan had hired was a massive, heavily tattooed man who specialized in high-conflict corporate evictions. He had strict instructions not to leave quietly. He pounded his heavy fists against the expensive wood, loudly announcing his legal presence. Megan nervously excused herself from the table, her face tightening with sheer embarrassment as she practically sprinted down the hallway to stop the noise before her wealthy guests became suspicious. She angrily yanked the heavy oak door open, fully prepared to unleash a vicious verbal assault on whoever dared to interrupt her elite gathering. The process server did not give her a chance to speak. He immediately stepped forward, firmly planting his heavy work boot directly onto her pristine marble entryway to prevent her from slamming the door shut. He asked for Jordan and Megan by their full legal names. When Megan aggressively confirmed her identity, he did not politely hand her a discreet envelope. Instead, he pulled out a massive, highly visible, neon yellow legal document. With ruthless efficiency, he pulled a roll of heavy-duty industrial tape from his tool belt and aggressively taped the glowing neon notice of foreclosure directly onto the center of her $10,000 custom oak door. He aggressively smoothed the thick tape down, ensuring the bright yellow paper could not be easily removed without damaging the expensive wood finish. He loudly declared that they were in total default of their primary mortgage agreement with Oak Ridge Investment LLC and that formal property seizure proceedings had officially commenced today. His booming, authoritative voice carried clearly down the grand hallway, echoing directly into the formal dining room where all of her wealthy, highly judgmental friends were sitting in absolute stunned silence, listening to every single humiliating word. The process server took a quick digital photograph of the brightly taped document on the door as undeniable legal proof of service, tipped his hat sarcastically, and walked back to his vehicle without waiting for her stunned response. The neon yellow paper practically glowed under the bright porch lights, a glaring symbol of their immediate financial ruin for the entire upscale neighborhood to see. Megan stood frozen in the grand entryway, her breath catching in her throat as the taillights of the process server's vehicle disappeared down the dark street. She stared blindly at the massive neon yellow document taped to her beautiful front door. The bold black letters spelling out the word foreclosure seemed to mock her entire existence. The suffocating silence from the dining room behind her confirmed her absolute worst fear. Her elite social circle had heard absolutely everything. Her carefully constructed facade of generational wealth and corporate success had just been violently ripped away in a matter of seconds. The sheer humiliation quickly mutated into a blinding, unhinged rage. She grabbed the edges of the heavy paper and violently ripped it off the wood, tearing the document into tiny pieces and throwing them furiously onto the manicured lawn. She stormed back into the dining room, her face completely flushed with pure anger. Her wealthy guests were already standing up, awkwardly collecting their coats and muttering empty excuses about needing to leave early. Jordan sat paralyzed at the head of the table, his confident smile entirely gone, staring blankly at his cold dinner plate. Once the front door finally closed behind the last fleeing guest, Megan unleashed a terrifying scream. She threw a crystal glass against the wall, watching it shatter into pieces. She marched over to Jordan, practically spitting her words as she demanded to know how a massive corporate default had happened without his knowledge. Jordan stammered weakly, completely unable to provide a logical explanation for his catastrophic financial negligence. Megan cut him off brutally. She coldly stated that she would not allow some faceless, predatory garbage lending company to embarrass her in her own home. She pointed a finger at him and declared her plan for tomorrow morning. She swore she would drive directly to the main executive branch of the regional bank first thing in the morning. She told Jordan she was going to have her wealthy father write a massive blank check to completely buy out this pathetic LLC and completely crush the arrogant creditor who dared to threaten her perfect life. The very next morning, Megan executed her arrogant plan exactly as she had promised her husband. She bypassed the standard teller lines at the massive downtown branch of the regional bank, completely ignoring the polite security guards who tried to guide her to a customer service desk. She marched directly up to the executive floors, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. She was wearing her most intimidating corporate outfit, a sharp white blazer and dark sunglasses projecting an aura of absolute untouchability. She barged straight past the executive assistant stationed outside the main boardroom, ignoring the frantic protests that the room was currently reserved for a private corporate meeting. Megan threw the heavy glass doors open and marched into the spacious, sunlight-filled executive boardroom. She slammed her expensive leather handbag onto the center of the massive mahogany conference table. The bank branch manager, a nervous man in a gray suit who had been frantically reviewing the sudden foreclosure documents sent over by my attorney, jumped in his leather chair. Megan did not even let the poor man introduce himself. She aggressively reached into her blazer pocket, pulled out a pristine checkbook belonging directly to her extremely wealthy father, and violently slapped a pre-signed blank check flat onto the table. She demanded absolute immediate compliance. She commanded the branch manager to call the chief executive officer of Oak Ridge Investment LLC right this exact second. She loudly declared that she was fully prepared to write a check for the entire remaining balance of her distressed mortgage plus whatever pathetic penalty fees this garbage company felt entitled to charge her. She stated that her family possessed far more liquid capital than some cowardly, faceless corporate entity that hid behind neon yellow foreclosure notices in the night. She stood at the head of the boardroom table, crossing her arms tightly across her chest, tapping her foot impatiently. She truly believed that her father's immense wealth was an invincible shield. She demanded the manager bring the head of the company into the room so she could personally crush him. The nervous branch manager did not need to make a single phone call to summon the chief executive officer. He simply looked past Megan's shoulder, his eyes widening in deep respect as the heavy, solid oak doors of the executive boardroom slowly swung open behind her. I stepped into the room. I was no longer wearing the faded denim jeans and worn-out work boots that she constantly mocked at family gatherings. I was impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored dark charcoal gray wool suit that fit me perfectly. A crisp white dress shirt and a subtle silk tie completed the professional armor I had specifically chosen for this exact moment. Jonathan Kaplan walked closely right beside me, holding a thick black leather briefcase containing every single legal document necessary to finalize her ultimate financial destruction. Megan heard the heavy doors open and whipped her head around a smug, highly arrogant smile already forming on her face as she prepared to aggressively berate whoever dared to challenge her. But the very second her eyes landed on me, that confident smile completely vanished. It was instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated cognitive dissonance. She physically recoiled, stepping back from the mahogany table as if the floor beneath her had suddenly turned into burning coals. She blinked rapidly, staring at my expensive tailored suit, completely unable to process the visual information in front of her. In her heavily prejudiced, narrow-minded reality, I was nothing more than an uneducated, impoverished, older black mechanic who relied entirely on her husband for basic survival. I was the pathetic old man she had tried to brutally evict from his own home just yesterday morning. The fact that I was standing inside the most secure, highly restricted executive boardroom of a major regional bank was utterly impossible for her arrogant brain to comprehend today. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a sharp, confused gasp escaped her lips. She looked frantically between me, my ruthless attorney Jonathan, and the terrified branch manager who was currently standing up from his chair to offer me a highly respectful greeting. The branch manager nervously cleared his throat, gesturing politely toward the head of the conference table. He formally introduced me to Megan, stating very clearly that Mr. Anthony Hayes was the sole primary shareholder and the acting chief executive officer of Oak Ridge Investment, LLC. He confirmed that I personally held the exclusive, absolute legal right to her entire distressed mortgage portfolio. The words hit her like a massive physical blow to the chest. Her jaw literally dropped open. The expensive designer sunglasses she had perched proudly on top of her head suddenly slid down, falling onto the carpeted floor with a dull thud. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrifying, sickening realization. The faceless, powerful corporate entity she had planned to easily crush with her wealthy father's money was actually the exact same man she had relentlessly disrespected, deeply humiliated, and actively tried to destroy for years. The massive power dynamic she had built her entire identity upon instantly inverted, leaving her entirely exposed, completely powerless, and totally at my absolute mercy in this very room. She was no longer a predator. She was merely a desperate trespasser drowning in her own foolishness. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my footsteps entirely silent against the thick carpet. I did not raise my voice or show any emotion. I stopped directly across from where she was standing, completely ignoring her trembling hands. I looked down at the pristine blank check her father had signed. It was a pathetic attempt to throw money at a problem that required basic human decency. I calmly reached out, picked up the expensive piece of paper, and deliberately tore it precisely in half. I dropped the torn pieces directly onto the polished mahogany wood. Megan flinched as if I had physically struck her across the face. She stammered, her voice cracking in pure desperation, begging me to reconsider. She offered to double the original payment, frantically promising to apologize publicly for her past behavior. I did not entertain her pathetic bargaining for a single second. Jonathan unlatched his heavy briefcase, pulled out a stark white legal document bearing a bright red court seal, and handed it directly to me. I slid the thick paper slowly across the smooth table until it rested right in front of her shaking fingers. I looked her dead in the eyes, ensuring she felt the absolute crushing weight of my final judgment. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm. I told her that she and Jordan had exactly 48 hours to completely vacate my property before the sheriff arrived to physically remove them. I explicitly warned her not to touch a single valuable item inside the house. I coldly instructed her to leave the custom oak dining table, the imported luxury beds, and absolutely all of the expensive designer furniture right where it was. It now belonged entirely to me as partial compensation for the severe emotional damage and massive financial fraud they had aggressively inflicted upon my life. She stood frozen, weeping silently. Her entire world was effectively gone. She fumbled for her phone, sprinting out of the room in absolute hysterics to call her husband and warn him about the disaster. They were incredibly desperate. I knew they would attempt something incredibly stupid and violently dangerous before the sun finally set. This was the brutal reality of their actions finally catching up to them without mercy. Megan ran out of the executive boardroom and practically collapsed into the carpeted hallway of the bank. Her hands were shaking so violently that she dropped her phone twice before she finally managed to unlock the screen and dial her husband. Jordan answered on the second ring, confidently expecting to hear the triumphant news that her wealthy father had successfully purchased their distressed mortgage and permanently solved all their financial problems. Instead, he heard the frantic, hyperventilating sobs of a woman whose entire, carefully constructed reality had just been violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Megan could barely form a coherent sentence. She screamed frantically into the phone, her shrill voice echoing loudly off the polished marble walls of the quiet bank corridor. She told him that the blank check was torn in half. She told him that there was absolutely no faceless corporate board to negotiate with today. She finally choked out the horrifying, impossible truth, explicitly stating that his despised, allegedly impoverished black father was the sole primary shareholder and the acting chief executive officer of Oak Ridge Investment, LLC. She sobbed uncontrollably, repeating over and over again that Anthony legally owned their luxury mansion and had ruthlessly ordered them to vacate the premises within 48 hours without taking a single piece of furniture. Jordan stood completely frozen in the middle of his failing technology startup office. The expensive smartphone slipped slightly from his sweaty ear. The absolute impossibility of her panicked words crashed heavily into his brain, completely short-circuiting his highly arrogant mind. His father was a simple retired mechanic. His father was an elderly man who lived quietly in a small house and drank cheap coffee on his front porch. The massive cognitive dissonance was far too great for his fragile ego to process rationally. The devastating realization that he had knowingly forged a highly illegal shadow loan against a man who possessed enough liquid capital to buy and sell his entire corporate existence twice over completely broke his sanity. A dark, incredibly violent desperation completely consumed him. He dropped his phone directly onto his messy desk, sprinted wildly out of his glass office building, and threw himself forcefully into the driver's seat of his imported luxury sedan. He did not care about standard traffic laws today. He did not care about protecting his precious public image. He slammed his expensive leather shoe down hard on the accelerator, his powerful car engine roaring aggressively as he sped recklessly across the city toward my quiet neighborhood. He arrived at my street with his tires screaming loudly against the black asphalt. He did not slow down when he saw my newly reinforced wrought iron front gate. He lost his mind completely. He aimed his heavy silver vehicle directly at the solid metal barrier and aggressively floored the gas pedal. The heavy luxury car smashed violently through the iron gate, tearing the thick metal hinges straight out of the heavy stone pillars with a deafening crunch. The massive frontal impact crumpled the hood of his expensive vehicle and instantly deployed the internal airbags with a loud, violent explosion. The ruined car careened wildly across my front yard, completely destroying the perfectly manicured landscaping, crushing the thick rose bushes, and digging deep, ugly, muddy trenches across the green lawn, before finally slamming to a violent, smoking halt just inches away from the wooden steps of my front porch. The loud, explosive crash of the vehicle collision violently shook the entire solid foundation of my house. I was sitting quietly in my living room, having just recently returned from the triumphant meeting at the regional bank, completely anticipating a desperate and highly aggressive retaliation from my son. I did not move from my comfortable armchair. Through the large front living room window, I calmly watched Jordan violently kick open the jammed driver's side door of his wrecked luxury sedan. He stumbled clumsily out onto my ruined lawn, coughing heavily from the thick white chemical smoke billowing from the deployed airbags. His expensive tailored designer suit was torn at the shoulder and covered entirely in white powder. His face was twisted into a deeply unrecognizable, horrifying mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was no longer a confident, smooth-talking corporate executive. He was a cornered, highly frantic animal acting entirely on blind, destructive panic. He marched aggressively toward the trunk of his smoking vehicle, yanked the metal latch open, and pulled out a solid, heavy steel tire iron. He gripped the heavy metal weapon incredibly tightly in his right hand, his knuckles turning completely white from the immense pressure. He marched heavily up the wooden steps of my front porch, screaming my name at the top of his lungs like an absolute madman. He aggressively demanded that I open the front door immediately. He grabbed the heavy brass front door handle, shaking it violently with all his might, but the premium military-grade smart locks I had installed just yesterday held completely firm. The heavy, solid oak door did not budge a single millimeter. Jordan quickly realized he could not break the reinforced electronic lock. He stepped back, breathing heavily like a wild beast, and turned his furious, bloodshot gaze directly toward the large, pristine glass window of my front living room. He raised the heavy steel tire iron high above his head and swung it forward with absolutely all of his physical strength. The thick window glass shattered instantly with a horrific, deafening crash. Huge, jagged shards of broken glass rained down heavily onto the living room floor, scattering dangerously across the vintage woven rug. Jordan used the heavy metal tool to aggressively clear the remaining sharp edges from the wooden window frame. He hoisted his body up and clumsily climbed right through the broken window, tearing his expensive trousers and slicing his left arm deeply on a hidden piece of sharp glass. Dark red blood began to seep quickly through the fabric of his white shirt sleeve, but he did not even seem to register the physical pain. His eyes were completely wild and unfocused as he landed heavily inside my quiet house. He stood up straight, tightly gripping the bloody steel weapon, and glared across the room directly at me. I remained perfectly seated in my armchair, my hands resting calmly and casually on my lap, watching his violent armed home invasion with absolute chilling, cold detachment. He pointed the heavy, bloody tire iron directly at my face. His voice shook with a terrifying, unpredictable mixture of violent anger and desperate, pathetic pleading. He screamed that I had completely ruined his entire life. He demanded that I immediately produce the official corporate ownership documents for Oak Ridge Investment, LLC. He aggressively stepped much closer, his heavy leather boots crunching loudly on the thick broken glass covering the hardwood floor. He explicitly threatened to physically beat me within an inch of my life until I signed full legal control of the massive company directly over to him. He had completely convinced his fractured mind that brute physical force could miraculously erase his massive federal financial crimes and somehow undo the permanent legal foreclosure of his beautiful luxury mansion. He loomed dangerously over my chair, raising the heavy metal weapon much higher, screaming loudly that he was my only flesh and blood son and that he rightfully deserved absolutely all the hidden wealth I had maliciously kept away from him. He violently ordered me to get up from my chair, fetch a pen, and sign away my entire life savings immediately to save his pathetic, ruined reputation. He was fully prepared to commit violent physical assault to force my absolute compliance. I looked calmly up at the heavy steel weapon hovering dangerously just a few short inches above my head. I did not flinch away from him. I did not beg for mercy or attempt to logically reason with a desperate man who had clearly abandoned all rational thought. I simply looked him directly in his wild eyes and offered a very slight, incredibly cold smile. I told him in a very steady, quiet voice that he was far too late. The piercing, unmistakable wail of multiple police sirens suddenly erupted from the street outside, cutting violently through the tense, heavy silence of the destroyed living room. The loud, mechanical sound was incredibly close and multiplying rapidly by the second. Jordan froze completely in place, the heavy metal tool trembling uncontrollably in his raised hand. The remaining color drained entirely from his flushed face as the terrifying, inescapable realization crashed violently over him. I had not been sitting passively in my armchair, simply waiting to become a helpless victim today. The exact second his speeding luxury vehicle had violently breached my reinforced iron front gate, my right hand had naturally slipped into my jacket pocket and firmly pressed the silent emergency panic button connected directly to my premium security system. The local police dispatch had instantly received a priority, one automated alert for an active armed home invasion currently in progress at my exact address. Before Jordan could even turn around to look out the shattered front window, multiple black and white police cruisers swarmed my ruined front lawn, their bright red and blue emergency lights flashing intensely through the destroyed living room. Heavy tactical footwear pounded rapidly up the wooden porch steps. Heavily armed police officers poured aggressively through the shattered front window and violently kicked open the back kitchen door simultaneously. They instantly saw a bleeding, unhinged younger man standing directly over a calm, elderly homeowner while aggressively holding a raised steel weapon. They did not hesitate for a single second. Two massive, heavily armored officers tackled Jordan simultaneously, hitting his torso with such incredible physical force that the heavy steel tire iron flew right out of his bloody hand and crashed loudly into the far wall. They drove his face aggressively down into the hardwood floor, screaming strict, uncompromising commands to stop resisting while they violently wrenched his arms tightly behind his back. The loud, sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed sharply through the quiet room. A senior police officer stood over him and loudly read him his Miranda rights, formally placing him under immediate arrest for armed burglary, malicious destruction of private property, and felony home invasion. Jordan laid completely flat on my living room floor, his bleeding face pressed painfully against the cold wood, completely surrounded by broken glass and his own completely shattered pride. He stared blankly at the wall, finally realizing his entire arrogant life was completely and permanently over. The heavy iron door of the holding cell slammed shut, echoing with a hollow metallic finality that Jordan had never experienced in his heavily sheltered life. He spent the entire agonizing night shivering on a thin, notoriously uncomfortable concrete bench surrounded by hardened criminals who did not care about his tailored suits or his inflated corporate title. His left arm throbbed violently from the deep glass cut he sustained during his unhinged home invasion, clumsily bandaged by an indifferent jail nurse. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the blinding red and blue police lights and the cold, unyielding stare of the father he had so foolishly underestimated. He was no longer the arrogant tech chief executive. He was a broken, terrified inmate facing multiple severe felony charges, including armed burglary and malicious destruction of private property. Across the city, Megan was experiencing her own personal hell. Her wealthy father, completely mortified by her public humiliation at the bank and deeply terrified of being legally implicated in a federal tax evasion investigation, had completely cut off her access to the family trust fund. He refused to answer her desperate midnight phone calls. She was entirely on her own. Panic consumed her as she frantically liquidated her remaining emergency credit lines, maxing out 3 different high-interest credit cards just to scrape together the massive sum required for Jordan and his temporary release. She stood at the grimy bail bondsman counter just as the sun began to rise, her designer makeup smeared and her arrogant posture completely gone. She handed over every single usable dime she had left to her absolute name. Hours later, Jordan was finally released from police custody. He walked out of the bleak county precinct wearing the exact same blood-stained, torn white dress shirt from the day before. He looked completely defeated. Megan did not hug him. She did not offer any words of comfort. She simply unlocked the doors of a cheap rental car she had managed to secure aggressively, commanding him to get inside so they could return to their mansion and barely survive. The drive back to their upscale suburban neighborhood was silent. The thick tension inside the cheap rental car was suffocating. Jordan stared blankly out the passenger window, nursing his injured arm while Megan gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. They were exhausted, utterly broke, and entirely dependent on the luxurious sanctuary of their 5-bedroom estate to hide from the massive public fallout of their disastrous actions. They turned the final corner onto their pristine, tree-lined street, expecting to pull into their wide driveway and finally collapse behind their solid, custom oak front door. Instead, Megan abruptly slammed on the car brakes, pitching Jordan violently forward against his seatbelt. Their grand, incredibly expensive mansion had been completely transformed over the course of a single night. A fleet of heavily marked black sport utility vehicles was strategically parked along the entire perimeter of the manicured front lawn. A thick, impenetrable perimeter of bright yellow security tape was tightly stretched across the tall iron driveway gates, blocking any vehicle access to the sprawling property. 4 massive, heavily muscled private security contractors wearing dark tactical uniforms and thick protective vests were standing firmly at attention directly in front of the main entrance. The brilliant morning sun reflected sharply off the bright silver badges pinned securely to their chests. They were not local neighborhood watchmen or polite country club attendants. They were elite corporate security professionals operating under strict legal orders to protect a highly valuable seized financial asset. Jordan and Megan slowly stepped out of their small rental car, their legs trembling uncontrollably as the harsh, undeniable reality of their total eviction finally registered. They limped pathetically up the concrete sidewalk, completely dwarfed by the sheer imposing presence of the armed guards surrounding their former home. Megan aggressively marched toward the front door, furiously digging through her expensive leather handbag to retrieve her heavy ring of brass house keys. She stubbornly refused to accept her power was truly gone. She pushed past the first security guard, who simply stepped aside with a cold, indifferent smirk, and aggressively jammed her gold-plated key directly into the shiny metal deadbolt of the custom oak door. The key did not turn. She jiggled it violently, cursing loudly under her breath, desperately trying to force the complicated internal mechanism to yield. She quickly realized the entire locking system had been completely extracted and replaced with heavy-duty commercial-grade electronic keypads. The massive mansion was officially sealed shut. The lead security contractor, a tall man with a thick beard and cold eyes, stepped calmly down from the wide porch and blocked her path. He handed her a crisp, laminated legal document formally detailing the immediate corporate seizure of the entire property by Oak Ridge Investment, LLC. He explicitly informed them they were now legally categorized as hostile trespassers on private corporate land. He clearly stated that absolutely all interior access was permanently revoked and that if they attempted to bypass the sealed locks or breach the secure perimeter, his security team was fully authorized to physically detain them until local police arrived to execute a second immediate arrest. Jordan collapsed onto his knees on the concrete, staring blankly at the locked door of the massive mansion he no longer owned as neighbors watched. Megan stood entirely paralyzed on the wide porch, her frantic mind desperately struggling to comprehend the absolute totality of her devastating loss. The massive luxury mansion was completely gone. Her immense social status was now permanently shattered. Her wealthy friends had completely abandoned her, and her own father had brutally cut her off. She frantically looked through the thick glass panels of the front door, staring hungrily into the grand foyer, where her extensive, incredibly expensive collection of imported Italian designer handbags was perfectly displayed on a custom floating shelf. Those rare leather bags were worth tens of thousands of dollars, representing the last remaining fragments of her shattered aristocratic identity. She violently turned back toward the imposing lead security guard, her voice rising into a shrill, completely unhinged shriek. She aggressively demanded that he immediately open the door and allow her to retrieve her personal designer bags, loudly claiming they were private property entirely exempt from any corporate real estate foreclosure process. She practically screamed that she absolutely refused to leave the premises today without her precious luxury items. The tall guard did not even blink at her hysterical outburst. He simply keyed a short command into the radio microphone securely clipped to his shoulder. Less than 10 seconds later, a second heavily armored guard walked around the corner of the sprawling estate carrying a very large, incredibly cheap black plastic trash bag. He approached Megan with a look of absolute chilling indifference and casually tossed the crumpled black trash bag directly at her freezing feet. The thin plastic tore slightly upon impact with the hard concrete spilling its contents onto the walkway. It did not contain her pristine designer leather goods or her sparkling diamond jewelry. It simply contained a few pairs of highly faded, incredibly cheap gray sweatpants, some extremely basic cotton shirts, and a single pair of worn-out sneakers. Megan stared down at the pathetic pile of clothing in absolute suffocating horror. The lead private security contractor leaned forward, his deep voice carrying a terrifying absolute finality. He very coldly stated that her expensive luxury items had been officially seized by Oak Ridge Investment, LLC, to legally offset the exact $40,000 her husband had maliciously stolen from Mr. Hayes' emergency bank account. The violent destruction Jordan caused to my property required immediate attention. I had a professional contracting crew temporarily board up my shattered front living room window and haul away his wrecked luxury sedan by early morning. The house was quiet again, but the brief peace did not last long. Right around noon, a massive, heavily tinted black limousine pulled up to my ruined front curb. The driver quickly stepped out and opened the rear door. Megan's parents, an incredibly wealthy and notoriously arrogant couple who had spent the last 5 years actively avoiding my presence at every single family gathering, stepped out onto my cracked sidewalk. They were closely followed by a sharp-looking corporate lawyer clutching a premium leather briefcase. They looked at the temporary wooden boards covering my front window with obvious disgust, clearly assuming I was simply too impoverished to afford proper glass repairs. They did not bother knocking on my heavy front door. They simply pushed through my broken iron gate and marched directly into my home, treating my private property like a public waiting room. I was sitting calmly at my dining room table, drinking a fresh cup of coffee and reviewing some legal documents provided by Jonathan Kaplan. Megan's father, a man who built a highly successful regional manufacturing empire on the backs of underpaid laborers, stood at the head of my table and glared down at me. He did not offer a polite greeting or acknowledge the severe trauma his daughter and my son had just inflicted upon my life. He unbuttoned his expensive custom-tailored suit jacket, sat down uninvited, and signaled for his lawyer to stand beside him. Megan's mother remained standing near the entryway, aggressively clutching her pearl necklace and looking around my modest home as if the very air inside was deeply contaminated. They were completely convinced that my corporate takeover of their daughter's massive luxury mansion was nothing more than a lucky temporary clerical error. They were here to quickly resolve the annoying issue with absolute financial brute force and put me back into my designated lower social class. The arrogant manufacturing tycoon leaned heavily against the edge of my oak dining table, exuding a foul mixture of expensive cologne and absolute entitlement. His corporate lawyer quickly snapped open the metal latches of his premium leather briefcase and retrieved a perfectly printed banking document. The lawyer handed the document to Megan's father, who then arrogantly tossed it flat onto the center of the wooden table. It was a certified cashier check made payable directly to my full legal name. I slowly looked down at the printed numbers. The check was written for exactly $100,000. To a working-class mechanic, that amount of money would normally represent a massive, life-changing windfall. To this wealthy, highly prejudiced couple, it was simply the cost of doing standard business, a financial nuisance used to effortlessly squash a peasant who temporarily stepped out of line. Megan's father tapped his thick index finger aggressively against the glossy surface of the certified check. He spoke with a deeply condescending voice, completely devoid of any basic human respect. He told me that he was fully aware of the highly unfortunate foreclosure situation involving his daughter and the absurd corporate entity I supposedly managed. He explicitly commanded me to take the generous money resting on the table, cancel the legal eviction notice placed on their massive luxury mansion, and sign complete control of the property deed directly over to his corporate holding company by the end of the day. He leaned closer, his face turning an ugly shade of red, and told me in no uncertain terms that I needed to quietly take the money and finally know my proper place in this world. He sneered, adding that a man of my background should consider himself incredibly lucky to receive such a massive charitable donation. Megan's mother scoffed from the entryway, loudly agreeing that I was displaying a shocking lack of gratitude. They fully expected me to instantly bow my head in deep submission, eagerly grab the expensive piece of paper, and quietly vanish back into the impoverished margins of society where they firmly believed I belonged. I did not reach for the certified check. I did not raise my voice or show any outward sign of being intimidated by their offensive behavior. I simply looked at the arrogant tycoon and offered a slow, highly calculated smile. It was the exact same chilling smile I had given my unhinged son right before the local police violently arrested him. I calmly reached out my right hand and deliberately pushed the expensive $100,000 check back across the smooth wooden table until it was resting directly in front of him. His smug expression faltered slightly, clearly confused by my blatant refusal to accept his massive financial bribe. Without saying a single word, I reached into the thick stack of legal documents Jonathan Kaplan had prepared for me earlier that morning. I pulled out a heavy, incredibly detailed commercial contract that bore the official corporate seal of Oak Ridge Investment, LLC. I held the thick document in my hands for a brief second, savoring the immense weight of the devastating legal trap I was about to spring upon them. With absolute precision, I placed the massive commercial lease agreement directly on top of his rejected check. Megan's father stared down at the heavy commercial document, his thick eyebrows knitting together in deep confusion. He did not immediately recognize the specific property address printed boldly across the top of the very first page. His highly paid corporate lawyer, however, recognized it instantly. The lawyer gasped incredibly loudly, his expensive briefcase slipping from his trembling fingers and hitting the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. The lawyer frantically pointed at the official corporate seal on the paper, practically stammering as he tried to explain the catastrophic reality to his arrogant client. Decades ago, long before I formally created Oak Ridge Investment LLC, I had aggressively purchased a massive, entirely abandoned industrial complex located right on the developing outskirts of the city. It was a filthy, deeply undesirable piece of commercial property at the time, but I saw immense long-term potential. 10 years later, a rising regional manufacturing company desperately needed a massive central warehouse to rapidly expand their local operations. I instructed my corporate attorneys to lease the entire industrial complex to them through my anonymous corporate holding company. That rapidly expanding manufacturing company belonged entirely to Megan's father. For over 15 incredibly profitable years, his entire regional supply chain, his massive inventory stockpiles, and his highly lucrative distribution network had operated entirely out of a commercial warehouse that I legally owned. I looked directly into his rapidly paling face and watched the devastating realization completely shatter his arrogant facade. I leaned forward, resting my forearms comfortably on the oak dining table, and spoke with absolute terrifying clarity. I told him that I was officially terminating our long-standing commercial relationship. I explicitly stated that I am not renewing your lease next month. I informed him that his manufacturing empire had exactly 30 days to completely vacate my massive industrial property before I legally locked the gates and formally seized his entire operational inventory to aggressively cover the remaining massive unpaid balance of his daughter's fraudulent shadow loan. Megan's mother collapsed against the entryway wall in absolute horror. Her incredibly wealthy husband was suddenly choking on his own breath. They came into my modest home today trying to secretly buy my absolute total submission with a pathetic financial bribe. They were leaving completely ruined forever. The heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse swung closed, sealing us inside a room where wealth and privilege held absolutely no power. It had been several long, grueling months since the violent incident at my house, and the physical toll of their massive financial ruin was entirely visible. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing my tailored charcoal suit, watching my son and his wife sit at the defense table. They looked incredibly ragged and utterly terrified. Jordan was swimming in a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit that he had likely purchased off a discount rack. His previously immaculate hair was unkempt, and the dark, heavy bags under his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights spent in cheap motels. Megan sat rigidly beside him, completely stripped of her designer clothing and diamond jewelry. She wore a faded black dress, her face devoid of the expensive makeup she once used as armor. She kept her head down, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the massive courtroom. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman with an intimidating presence, stood before the judge and formally opened the trial. She methodically listed the severe charges against them, including aggravated identity theft, massive corporate fraud, and federal forgery. The sheer gravity of the charges hung heavily in the sterile courtroom air. The prosecutor clearly explained how Jordan had maliciously manipulated financial institutions and illegally leveraged my primary residence to secure a massive shadow loan for his failing tech startup. Jordan slouched in his wooden chair, visibly trembling as the devastating opening statement systematically dismantled his fabricated corporate reality. He was no longer the arrogant chief executive officer ordering his elderly father to sell his house. He was simply a desperate, terrified criminal facing a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The judge struck his heavy wooden gavel loudly, demanding absolute order in the court, and instructed the defense to officially and actively present their primary argument. Jordan slowly stood up, his weak legs, shaking visibly, completely preparing to play the only desperate, pathetic card he had left today. Jordan walked slowly toward the witness stand, his head bowed in a highly calculated display of deep remorse. He placed his trembling hand on the wooden railing and swore under oath to tell the absolute truth. The moment he sat down, the theatrical performance immediately began. His defense attorney, a public defender who looked entirely exhausted by his difficult client, asked him to explain the circumstances surrounding the massive shadow loan. Jordan immediately burst into heavy theatrical tears. He sobbed loudly, his voice cracking as he began to weave a completely fabricated, highly emotional narrative designed specifically to manipulate the jury. He looked directly at the jury box and painted me as an incredibly cruel, deeply unsupportive father who maliciously hoarded massive amounts of secret wealth while happily watching his only son struggle to survive in a highly competitive corporate environment. He cried about his failing technology startup, claiming he was under immense, crushing pressure to succeed and simply wanted to make his father proud. He wiped his fake tears with a tissue and boldly claimed that I had always been intensely jealous of his modern success. The lies flowed from his mouth with sickening ease. He completely omitted the fact that he and his wife had aggressively mocked my neighborhood, demanded I move into their basement, and brutally drained my $40,000 emergency savings account in the middle of the night. Instead, he portrayed himself as a desperate, loving victim of my cold, calculating corporate greed and unnatural vindictiveness. Then came the most egregious lie of the entire morning. His attorney gently asked him about the forged signature on the federal lending documents. Jordan looked the jury dead in the eye and committed absolute perjury without a single ounce of hesitation. He falsely swore under oath that I had explicitly given him clear verbal permission to use my fully paid-off house as financial collateral. He claimed we had held a private conversation in my living room where I told him to sign the documents on my behalf because my hands were supposedly too arthritic to hold a pen properly. He loudly insisted that I only turned against him and reported the loan as fraudulent because we had a minor disagreement later that evening and I vindictively wanted to punish him. He painted my entire corporate takeover as a malicious, premeditated trap designed specifically to steal his beautiful luxury mansion and completely destroy his marriage. The sheer audacity of his testimony was absolutely breathtaking. He sat on the witness stand crying pathetic tears, trying to convince 12 ordinary citizens that I was a ruthless monster who intentionally orchestrated my own son's tragic downfall. The jury watched him with sympathetic eyes, clearly swayed by his intense emotional display. Megan looked up from the defense table, a tiny hopeful smirk temporarily returning to her pale face. They genuinely believed his crying had successfully planted a solid seed of reasonable doubt. They thought they were going to legally escape the severe consequences of their massive financial crimes. The exhausted public defender finally respectfully concluded his lengthy direct examination, leaving the courtroom in a heavy, contemplative silence. Jordan sniffled very softly, leaning back in the wooden witness chair, looking exactly like a deeply wounded and entirely wrongfully persecuted innocent martyr today. Jonathan Kaplan stood up from his seat beside the federal prosecutor. The presiding judge had explicitly granted Jonathan special permission to lead the cross-examination because he possessed unparalleled knowledge of the massive financial fraud. Jonathan did not carry a single notepad. He did not ask Jordan a single introductory question. He simply walked to the center of the courtroom, his expensive shoes echoing sharply on the polished floor, and turned his cold gaze directly toward the witness stand. He approached the electronic evidence podium, plugged his laptop directly into the courtroom audio-visual system, and looked at the jury. He calmly and firmly stated that he had absolutely no questions for a man who had completely abandoned his relationship with the truth. Instead, he simply pressed a single button on his keyboard. The massive courtroom speakers crackled to life. The absolutely crystal-clear audio recording of the fake doctor filled the silent room. The jury heard my calm, authoritative voice relentlessly interrogating the terrified fraudster, clearly exposing the malicious plot Megan and Jordan had orchestrated to falsely declare me mentally incompetent just hours before the shadow loan was finalized. Jordan immediately turned stark white, his fake tears instantly drying up. But Jonathan was not finished. He clicked his mouse a second time. The large flat-screen monitors mounted across the courtroom flashed brightly, instantly displaying the high-definition security camera footage from my living room. The jury watched in absolute wide-eyed horror as Jordan aggressively smashed his heavy tire iron through my front window. They watched him climb through the shattered glass covered in dark blood, screaming violently unhinged threats while aiming a heavy steel weapon directly at my head, demanding I sign away my corporate LLC to cover his massive debts. The audio of his violent, desperate extortion attempt echoed deafeningly through the federal courthouse, completely obliterating his carefully crafted, pathetic victim narrative. Megan buried her face in her trembling hands, quietly sobbing as absolute doom settled over them. Jonathan paused the violent video right on a clear, terrifying frame of Jordan's enraged face, turning back to the completely speechless defendant. He slowly raised a single eyebrow and coldly asked Jordan if he still wanted to loudly claim he was the truly innocent victim today. Jordan stared at the massive flat-screen monitor, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. He could not form a single coherent word to counter the overwhelming digital evidence of his own violent madness. His public defender quickly stood up, desperately asking the presiding judge for an immediate recess, but the request was firmly denied. The absolute truth had finally been dragged into the sterile fluorescent light of the federal courtroom. The 12 members of the jury looked at Jordan with expressions of profound disgust, completely repulsed by the pathetic weeping performance he had just attempted to sell them minutes earlier. The federal prosecutor did not even need to offer a closing statement. The unhinged audio recording and the violent security camera footage spoke with absolute, undeniable clarity. The judge leaned far over the elevated wooden bench, his face etched with severe judicial fury. He looked directly at Jordan and delivered a scathing reprimand, condemning his malicious actions as a deplorable betrayal of basic family trust and a severe violation of federal financial law. The judge aggressively slammed his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block. The loud, sharp crack echoed through the massive room with absolute finality. With that single decisive strike, the heavily fabricated shadow loan was officially and permanently nullified. The judge formally declared the signature on the primary collateral document to be a malicious forgery, legally voiding any and all financial claims against my personal property. A massive, suffocating weight instantly lifted off my shoulders. My fully paid-off house, the beautiful home where I had built my life and raised my family, was officially saved. The terrifying threat from the Internal Revenue Service was completely dissolved. The federal government would no longer attempt to aggressively seize my sanctuary to pay for my foolish son and his massive corporate debts. I sat quietly in the front row of the gallery, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute peace wash over my tired soul as the judge prepared to hand down the final criminal sentencing today. The courtroom fell into a tense, breathless silence as the judge began to outline the severe legal consequences of their massive fraudulent scheme. Because this was technically Jordan and his first major criminal offense, and owing to the severely overcrowded nature of the federal prison system, the judge decided against imposing a lengthy custodial sentence. Instead, the judge handed down a deeply punishing alternative. Jordan was officially convicted of felony fraud and sentenced to 5 years of highly supervised, incredibly strict federal probation. If he committed even a minor traffic violation during that lengthy period, he would immediately be sent directly to a federal penitentiary. But avoiding a dark prison cell did not mean he had somehow escaped his punishment. The judge aggressively imposed a truly staggering order of financial restitution. Jordan was legally ordered to completely repay the massive shadow loan alongside exorbitant federal fines, severe court costs, and mandatory punitive damages to the defrauded private lending firm. He was financially chained to a massive mountain of insurmountable debt for the rest of his natural life. Every single paycheck he ever earned would be violently garnished by federal authorities before he ever saw a single dime. Megan sat completely frozen beside him, foolishly hoping she had somehow managed to completely detach herself from the catastrophic fallout. She was drastically wrong. The federal prosecutor stood up and calmly announced a secondary judicial order. Because Megan was legally married to Jordan during the entire duration of the massive corporate fraud, and because she had actively benefited from the illegally acquired funds to maintain her lavish lifestyle, the federal government was officially seizing all of her remaining assets. The prosecutor confirmed that every single personal bank account, every hidden investment portfolio, and every remaining emergency credit line attached to her name had been completely frozen by federal authorities that very morning. Megan let out a pathetic, suffocated gasp. Her wealthy father had already brutally cut off her trust fund, and now the federal government had legally stripped away her absolute last remaining pennies. She was officially, completely destitute. The judge adjourned the hearing, instructing the federal marshals to process Jordan for his strict probationary release. I stood up from my wooden bench, adjusted my tailored suit jacket, and slowly walked out of the massive mahogany doors without looking back at them. I had successfully protected my hard-earned legacy and completely dismantled their arrogant empire of lies. An hour later, Jordan and Megan finally emerged from the heavy courthouse doors. They were entirely stripped of their massive luxury mansion, their expensive imported cars, and their incredibly inflated social status. They walked out into the cold, unforgiving city completely broke. They possessed absolutely nothing but the cheap clothes on their backs and the massive federal debt chained heavily around their necks. Jordan looked over at his wife, desperately seeking some small sliver of comfort or solidarity from the woman he had committed these massive crimes to impress. He stupidly believed that because they had lost absolutely everything else, they would at least face this horrifying new reality together as a united married couple confronting the entire world. He reached his shaking hand out toward her shoulder, desperately wanting to feel a familiar touch, hoping she would gently reassure him that they could rebuild. Megan violently recoiled from his touch as if his skin was completely covered in a highly contagious disease. They were standing directly on the wide concrete steps of the federal courthouse, completely surrounded by passing pedestrians and cold city winds. Jordan pulled his hand back quickly, his face twisting in deep confusion. He foolishly asked her where they were going to stay tonight, clearly expecting her to have somehow formulated a solid backup plan using her extensive social connections and wealthy friends. Megan did not answer him right away. She slowly turned to face him, her eyes burning with an intense, unbridled hatred that entirely stripped away any remaining illusion of their supposedly perfect marriage. She had spent years gleefully watching her husband aggressively bully me, actively enjoying the brutal violence and intimidation he frequently used to acquire their massive wealth. She had smiled when he stole my truck, and she had laughed loudly when he maliciously mocked my modest lifestyle. But she only loved the arrogant, victorious version of the monster she had married. She had absolutely no use for a completely defeated, entirely broke, convicted felon. She aggressively raised her right hand and violently slapped Jordan directly across his exhausted face. The loud, sharp sound of the physical strike echoed sharply across the concrete steps, perfectly mirroring the exact same brutal violence she had once so eagerly encouraged him to inflict upon me. Jordan stumbled backward, clutching his stinging cheek in absolute shock, his eyes welling with fresh, pathetic tears. Megan leaned forward, practically spitting her venomous words directly into his face. She told him that he was an absolute penniless loser who had completely ruined her perfect life forever. She stated that she would rather sleep outside on the freezing concrete sidewalk than spend another single second breathing the exact same air as a pathetic, incompetent criminal. Without uttering another word, she reached into her cheap plastic bag, pulled out a thick stack of aggressively prepared legal documents, and violently shoved them directly into his trembling bare hands. They were fully executed divorce papers. She turned her back on him and briskly walked away down the busy street, refusing to look back, permanently abandoning her broken husband right on the cold courthouse steps, completely alone. The freezing autumn rain began to fall shortly after sunset, rapidly turning into a relentless, punishing downpour. The temperature plummeted, turning the heavy raindrops into sharp needles of ice that mercilessly lashed against the city streets. I was sitting comfortably in my warm living room, reading a book by the glow of a small table lamp. The newly repaired front window offered a clear view of the dark, stormy street outside. Through the thick sheet of falling rain, I noticed a solitary, pathetic figure slowly dragging himself down the flooded sidewalk. It was Jordan. He had no car, no umbrella, and absolutely no pride left. He was carrying a single cheap canvas duffel bag slung over his drooping shoulder. He had walked several miles from the downtown federal courthouse, navigating the treacherous, freezing streets on foot because he could not even afford a simple bus ticket. His expensive, poorly fitted gray suit was completely soaked through, clinging tightly to his shivering, exhausted body. His leather dress shoes, completely unsuited for the brutal weather, sloshed loudly through deep puddles as he limped toward my property. He looked like a completely broken, defeated ghost, returning to haunt the very place he had violently tried to destroy. He reached my new heavily reinforced iron front gate and pushed it open with trembling, freezing hands. He dragged his feet heavily up the concrete walkway, completely ignoring the muddy trenches his ruined luxury car had violently dug into my front lawn months ago. The heavy rain washed the mud and grime over his ruined shoes. He slowly climbed the wooden steps of my front porch, his teeth chattering violently from the severe cold. He collapsed heavily against the solid oak front door, completely physically and mentally drained. He had nowhere else to go in the entire world. The massive dark city had entirely rejected him. He raised a shaking, bruised fist and knocked weakly on the thick wood, a pathetic, desperate sound barely audible over the roaring storm. He stood completely still, waiting for absolutely any merciful answer. I slowly closed my book, stood up from my comfortable armchair, and walked quietly toward the front entryway. I did not unlock the heavy deadbolt. I simply flipped a switch to illuminate the bright exterior porch lights and peered through the thick, reinforced glass panel beside the solid oak door. Jordan flinched as the bright light suddenly hit his face. He looked absolutely wretched. His hair was plastered flat against his skull, and cold rain dripped constantly from his nose and chin. When he saw my silhouette standing behind the glass, he immediately burst into deep, agonizing sobs. He pressed his cold, wet palms flat against the thick glass, leaving greasy handprints. He begged me to open the door. His voice was muffled by the heavy glass and the howling wind, but I could hear his pathetic pleading clearly enough. He cried out that he was freezing to death and had absolutely zero money to his name. He frantically confessed everything that had happened after he walked down the courthouse steps earlier today. He admitted through violent, shivering gasps that Megan had viciously slapped him in public, handed him fully executed divorce papers, and completely abandoned him right on the street without a single backward glance. He told me he had desperately spent the entire afternoon walking to public payphones, frantically calling every single affluent friend, former corporate colleague, and wealthy business associate he knew, begging them for a temporary loan or just a warm couch to sleep on. Every single one of them had immediately hung up the phone. His so-called friends, the same arrogant people who had happily attended his lavish dinner parties and drank his expensive vintage wine, completely severed all ties the exact second he became a convicted felon buried in massive federal debt. He was entirely socially radioactive. He slid slowly down the glass pane, dropping to his wet knees on the hard wooden porch floor. He clutched his cheap canvas duffel bag to his soaking chest and looked up at me with wide, completely terrified eyes. He begged me for just a tiny fraction of mercy. He promised he would not ask for a bedroom or a warm meal. He pleaded wildly, offering to sleep directly on the cold concrete floor of my dusty basement. He swore he would stay completely out of my way, silently haunting the lowest, darkest level of my house like a grateful rat if I would just unlock the heavy front door and let him escape the freezing rainstorm. He sobbed uncontrollably loudly, apologizing for forging my signature, apologizing for the massive shadow loan, and apologizing for breaking my front window with a heavy steel tire iron. He desperately tried to leverage the biological fact that he was my only flesh and blood child, hoping my natural paternal instincts would magically override the massive, unforgivable trauma he had aggressively inflicted upon my life. He was a drowning man desperately reaching for the exact same sturdy wooden ship he had intentionally tried to burn down just a few short months ago. He knelt there shivering violently in the freezing rain, offering his absolute unconditional surrender today. He wept openly, hoping pity would eventually break my rigid resolve completely forever. He genuinely believed his tears could instantly erase his crimes. I looked down at him through the thick, reinforced glass panel. I did not feel any sudden surge of warm, paternal forgiveness. I did not feel the overwhelming urge to quickly unlock the door, wrap a warm blanket around his shivering shoulders, and falsely pretend that our deeply shattered relationship could ever be fully repaired. I only felt a cold, incredibly profound sense of absolute finality. The man weeping pathetically on my front porch was not the innocent little boy I had lovingly raised alongside my late wife. He was a deeply corrupted, ruthlessly greedy stranger who had happily planned to forcefully toss me into a cheap assisted living facility to legally steal my fully paid-off home. I unlocked the small, heavy brass security grate covering a tiny rectangular opening in the center of the solid oak door. A blast of freezing rain immediately blew into the warm hallway, but I did not step back. Jordan looked up, his wet face instantly contorting into a mask of desperate, pathetic hope. He truly believed I was finally opening the door to let him inside. I leaned forward, bringing my face incredibly close to the cold metal grate. I spoke with a quiet, lethal calm that easily cut right through the howling storm. I reminded him of the incredibly cruel, deeply arrogant words he and his wealthy wife had viciously thrown directly into my face during that horrible Sunday dinner so many months ago. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes and told him exactly what he needed to hear. I said that he had explicitly told me basements are exclusively reserved for people who have completely outlived their societal usefulness. I told him to go find his own basement tonight. Without waiting for his frantic response, I forcefully slammed the heavy brass security grate entirely shut. I reached up and aggressively pulled the thick interior window blinds completely closed, entirely blocking his pathetic, shivering form from my sight. I reached out and decisively switched off the bright exterior porch lights. I plunged him completely back into the freezing, absolute darkness of the raging storm. I walked away completely, leaving him alone to finally face the brutal, uncompromising consequences of his deeply unforgivable actions entirely alone forever. The morning after the freezing storm, the sky cleared, leaving a crisp and brilliant blue canopy over the city. I met Jonathan Kaplan at the massive wrought iron gates of the 5-bedroom luxury mansion that now belonged entirely to me. The private security team unlocked the heavy electronic deadbolts and swung the thick custom oak front door open, allowing us to step inside the cavernous space. The grand foyer was completely silent, stripped entirely of the artificial warmth and arrogant energy that had once filled these halls. Our footsteps echoed loudly against the imported Italian marble floors as we walked through the sprawling, empty rooms. Megan and Jordan had left the massive house exactly as they were legally ordered to. The expensive designer furniture, the massive crystal chandeliers, and the custom-built dining table all remained perfectly in place, looking like a highly curated museum exhibit of their completely shattered lives. I walked into the massive master suite, looking at the panoramic windows that offered a sweeping view of the elite suburban neighborhood. This house was built entirely on a foundation of massive financial fraud, toxic arrogance, and a ruthless desire to constantly project an illusion of absolute superiority over everyone else. It felt incredibly cold, entirely devoid of genuine love, and deeply hollow inside. Jonathan stood beside me holding a thick leather folder containing the finalized property deeds and the complete corporate transfer documents. He looked around the extravagant room, mentally calculating the massive financial value of the seized asset. He quietly noted that Oak Ridge Investment, LLC, had successfully acquired a truly spectacular piece of premium real estate, pointing out that the current market value of the estate had significantly increased since Jordan originally purchased it. He asked me what my immediate plans were for the massive property, fully expecting me to quickly liquidate the mansion to instantly recover the stolen funds and aggressively pad my corporate investment portfolio. I looked at the extravagant crystal chandelier hanging heavily above my head. I had absolutely no desire to keep this monument to their extreme greed completely intact for another day. Word of the massive corporate foreclosure spread rapidly through the exclusive suburban community and the broader local real estate market. Less than 48 hours after we legally secured the empty mansion, a highly aggressive, incredibly wealthy real estate mogul contacted Jonathan directly. He offered to purchase the entire sprawling estate in an immediate all-cash transaction, explicitly promising a massive financial profit for Oak Ridge Investment, LLC. He wanted to quickly flip the luxury property, apply a fresh coat of expensive paint, and sell it to another wealthy, incredibly arrogant family desperate to buy their way into the elite neighborhood. Jonathan presented the incredibly lucrative cash offer to me during a morning meeting at his downtown office, clearly outlining the massive financial benefits of a quick, clean sale. I looked at the impressive numbers printed on the proposal, but I did not feel any temptation to sign the paper. I calmly slid the lucrative offer back across his desk and firmly shook my head. I told Jonathan that selling the massive house to another greedy billionaire would completely defeat the entire purpose of this brutal correction. I did not seize this estate simply to hoard more money. I seized it to completely dismantle the toxic legacy of arrogance and extreme selfishness my son had tried to build. I instructed Jonathan to immediately begin the highly complex legal process of radically rezoning the massive residential property. I wanted to permanently and completely strip away its elite, highly exclusive status. I hired a massive crew of commercial contractors, architects, and structural engineers to completely gut the extravagant interior. Within 2 weeks, the quiet, highly restrictive neighborhood was flooded with heavy construction equipment and loud work crews. They quickly and aggressively tore down the restrictive interior walls, completely removing the massive imported marble counters, the absurdly expensive wine cellar, and the useless private home theater. We ripped out the elitist soul of the mansion and systematically replaced it with highly functional, incredibly durable commercial-grade infrastructure. We built a massive, fully equipped state-of-the-art industrial kitchen capable of feeding dozens of hungry people simultaneously every single day. We transformed the massive 5 bedrooms into spacious, fully accessible dormitory suites equipped with premium medical beds and private bathrooms. We converted the sprawling, manicured backyard into a peaceful, therapeutic garden designed specifically for deep emotional healing and quiet reflection. The wealthy, highly prejudiced neighbors surrounding the large property were absolutely furious about this drastic change. They aggressively filed multiple frivolous complaints with the local city council, desperately trying to stop the massive construction project, terrified that their artificially inflated property values would plummet. Jonathan ruthlessly crushed every single legal challenge they presented, aggressively threatening them with massive corporate discrimination lawsuits until they entirely backed down and retreated into their own massive, quiet homes. The arrogant, exclusive sanctuary that Megan and Jordan had stolen from my own pocket to maliciously build was rapidly mutating into something deeply beautiful, highly functional, and profoundly meaningful. It was no longer a hollow monument to extreme corporate greed. It was rapidly becoming a beacon of genuine human survival, a massive testament to the enduring power of pure compassion over raw cruelty. The physical transformation was a total reclamation of morality and absolute justice. 6 months after the massive federal trial, the grueling construction was finally completed. Megan was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, wealthy woman who had once demanded I move into her basement. She was completely broke, rapidly drowning in severe financial debt, and desperately struggling to somehow survive entirely alone. She had been forced to take a highly demanding, severely underpaid job as an independent food delivery driver just to afford the monthly rent on a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment on the rougher side of town. She spent her long days navigating heavy city traffic in a cheap, heavily dented used car, constantly enduring the rudeness of impatient customers. Late one cold Tuesday afternoon, her dispatch application directed her to deliver a cheap fast food order to an address located directly inside her former elite neighborhood. She gripped the worn steering wheel incredibly tightly, her stomach violently twisting into painful knots as she slowly drove past the familiar manicured lawns and towering iron gates of the wealthy friends who had completely abandoned her. She turned the final corner onto her old street, desperately trying to avoid looking directly at the massive property she once proudly owned. However, she could not ignore the massive transformation that had occurred. She instinctively hit the brakes, bringing her cheap vehicle to a complete stop in the middle of the street. Her massive custom oak front door was completely gone, replaced by wide commercial glass doors. The tall iron gates had been permanently removed to create an open, highly welcoming entrance. But it was the massive, brilliantly illuminated sign standing proudly on the freshly cut front lawn that completely broke her fragile spirit. She stared silently through her dirty windshield, reading the bold, beautiful letters clearly displaying the words Diane Hayes Memorial Shelter for Displaced Veterans. The massive luxury estate she had used to relentlessly mock my supposedly inferior social status had been completely transformed into a premium charitable facility honoring my beloved late wife. Megan sat entirely alone in her cheap, heavily dented car, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She finally collapsed heavily forward, burying her wet face against the hard plastic steering wheel, and broke down crying uncontrollably as the stark, brutal reality of her absolute permanent ruin finally set in. 6 months had passed since the heavy wooden gavel fell in the federal courtroom. The harsh winter had slowly surrendered to a sweltering summer. I was sitting on my back porch enjoying a quiet Tuesday afternoon when my cell phone buzzed against the wooden table. I did not recognize the incoming number. It was a local area code, but the caller identification simply indicated it was a public payphone. I answered the call, holding the phone to my ear without speaking, waiting for the caller to announce themselves. The line crackled with heavy static, accompanied by the loud, chaotic background noise of clattering dishes and shouting voices. Then I heard his voice. It was Jordan. He sounded entirely different. The smooth, highly polished corporate cadence he had spent years perfecting was completely gone. He sounded incredibly exhausted, his words raspy and completely drained of life. He told me he was currently on his 10-minute break, standing in the narrow, grease-stained back alley behind a cheap diner located on the absolute worst side of the city. For the past 6 months, my son had been working grueling 14-hour shifts as a dishwasher just to meet the strict financial requirements of his federal probation and pay his court-ordered restitution. He had traded his custom-tailored designer suits for a permanently damp, foul-smelling apron. He spent his long days scraping hardened food off cheap ceramic plates, enduring the constant screaming of a highly aggressive line cook who did not care about his former corporate titles. He lived in a cramped, incredibly dangerous halfway house where he had to sleep with his wallet securely tucked inside his pillowcase. The massive federal debt chained heavily around his neck meant his entire meager paycheck was violently garnished every single week, leaving him with barely enough money to buy cheap canned food. He was standing by a filthy public payphone, physically exhausted, completely isolated and entirely stripped of the massive arrogance that had once defined his entire existence. He paused for a long moment, desperately gathering the necessary courage to speak now. Jordan swallowed hard, the sound highly audible over the terrible phone connection. He did not launch into a massive, arrogant speech. He did not aggressively demand that I fix his broken life or loudly threaten to sue me for everything I owned. He spoke with a quiet, deeply shattered humility that I had never heard from him before. He told me that his feet were constantly bleeding. The cheap, thin canvas sneakers he was wearing when Megan abandoned him on the courthouse steps had completely fallen apart months ago. The highly toxic mixture of industrial dishwashing chemicals, boiling hot water, and greasy kitchen floors had entirely eaten right through the cheap rubber soles. He was standing on his feet for 14 hours a day, sliding dangerously across wet commercial kitchen tiles, suffering from severe blisters and deeply infected cuts. He explained that his federal probation officer absolutely required him to maintain continuous, steady employment to avoid being sent directly to federal prison. If he lost this miserable diner job because he physically could not stand up to wash the dishes, he would immediately violate the strict terms of his federal release and be thrown into a dark cell. He needed proper slip-resistant steel-toed commercial work boots. He knew exactly how much they cost at the local discount supply store. He needed exactly $45. He was not asking for a massive shadow loan or $1 million luxury estate. He was a deeply desperate, thoroughly beaten man begging his father for $45 just to protect his bleeding feet from the harsh concrete floor. He promised me he would pay every single penny back. He swore he would aggressively save $1 from every single paycheck for the next 45 weeks and mail it directly to my house in a sealed envelope. He cried softly into the payphone receiver, his voice cracking violently under the immense weight of his absolute humiliation. He confessed that he had literally nowhere else to turn in the entire world. His wealthy former friends had completely blocked his phone number. Megan had legally finalized their divorce and disappeared entirely. His former corporate colleagues openly laughed at him when he desperately tried to apply for basic entry-level office jobs. The entire city knew exactly what he had done to me, and society had entirely rejected him as a deeply toxic, untrustworthy criminal. I sat incredibly still on my quiet back porch, listening to the tragic, broken sound of my own flesh and blood begging for basic survival gear. He was finally experiencing the brutal, uncompromising reality of the working-class life he had so casually mocked and aggressively despised for his entire adult life. He was learning exactly how hard a man must work simply to survive when he has absolutely no wealthy safety net to catch his fall. He finished his pathetic, tearful plea and waited in heavy silence for my absolute and ultimate judgment. He held his breath, desperately hoping that my natural paternal instincts would finally override the massive trauma he had caused today, praying I would instantly agree to wire him the small amount of cash so he could safely walk back into that terrible, greasy kitchen to finish his extremely long and painful shift tonight. I sat there quietly holding the small cell phone, carefully listening to the heavy, frantic breathing of a man who had completely run out of options in life. Any ordinary parent might have instantly crumbled under the sheer weight of their child begging for basic survival items like cheap work boots. A softer man might have quickly asked for the address of the diner and driven over to personally hand his son a crisp $50 bill, hoping the small gesture of extreme kindness would magically repair their shattered relationship. But I was definitely not a foolishly naive old man anymore today. I clearly remembered the cold, deeply unfeeling stare he had given me when he arrogantly demanded I sell my house. I vividly remembered the terrifying moment he violently smashed my front window with a heavy steel tire iron, fully prepared to physically attack me just to cover his massive corporate fraud. I knew absolutely, without a single shadow of a doubt, that if I sent him those $45 today, I would instantly reopen the highly toxic door of permanent financial dependency. If I saved him from the severe pain of his bleeding feet today, he would undoubtedly call me next month begging for rent money, and the month after that, begging for a used car. The brutal correction I had fought so intensely to achieve would be completely undone by a single moment of misplaced, dangerous pity. I took a very slow, deep breath, feeling the warm afternoon breeze gently rustle the green leaves in my quiet backyard. I looked up at the clear blue sky and spoke with a voice that was incredibly soft, yet entirely firm and absolutely uncompromising. I told him that a man learns the true value of his steps only when he pays for his own shoes. I definitely did not wait for his frantic response. I did not want to hear his renewed sobbing or his sudden desperate anger. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and decisively pressed the red button to permanently end the call. I immediately blocked the public payphone number on my device completely and permanently severing the toxic dependency, forever leaving him to finally walk his own path completely alone. The late summer afternoon draped a warm golden light across my newly repaired front porch. I sat comfortably on the heavy wooden swing I had built by hand over 30 years ago, the gentle creaking of the metal chains providing a steady, familiar rhythm to this quiet street. A tall glass of iced sweet tea rested securely in my right hand, the cold condensation dripping slowly down the smooth sides and pooling onto the armrest. The neighborhood had completely recovered from the violent disruption caused by my former son so many months ago. It was incredibly vibrant today. Children were riding their bicycles down the freshly paved sidewalks, their bright laughter echoing cheerfully through the towering oak trees. A cool breeze rustled the green leaves, carrying the rich, smoky scent of someone grilling in their backyard. I took a slow, refreshing sip of my sweet tea, savoring the absolute tranquility of the moment. Down by the wrought iron gate, which had been perfectly restored to its original strength, my neighbor Thomas walked by with his golden retriever. Thomas paused, tipping his worn baseball cap toward me with a bright, genuine smile. I raised my glass in return, acknowledging the deep, unspoken respect that now existed between us. Before the massive corporate foreclosure and the highly publicized federal trial, some of the newer residents had occasionally looked at me with subtle condescension, viewing me as a stubborn relic who refused to leave a rapidly gentrifying community. That completely changed when they witnessed how I decisively handled the vicious, calculated attack on my home. They saw the undeniable strength I possessed and the unyielding boundaries I successfully enforced against highly aggressive predators. I was no longer just the quiet, elderly black mechanic who lived on the corner. I was a man who commanded absolute respect, a permanent fixture of this community, who could never be intimidated, bullied, or forcibly removed. The quiet dignity of my daily life had become a truly powerful testament to personal resilience. I watched Thomas continue down the beautiful, peaceful street, feeling entirely safe, calm, and secure today. I set the sweating glass of iced tea back onto the small wooden table beside the swing and leaned my head against the slatted wooden backrest. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, allowing my mind to slowly drift back over the incredibly turbulent events of the past year. Many people from the outside looking in might easily misinterpret my drastic actions. They might look at the massive corporate foreclosure, the aggressive legal maneuvers, and the incredibly harsh courtroom outcome, and incorrectly conclude that I was completely driven by a dark, vindictive desire for cruel revenge against my own son. But revenge is a highly chaotic, deeply poisonous emotion that ultimately destroys the person wielding it. Revenge requires a person to actively hate, and I simply did not have the necessary energy to hate the boy I had lovingly raised. What I sought from the very first moment they rudely demanded my house keys at the dinner table was absolutely necessary correction. The entire modern world had unfortunately taught Jordan and his incredibly arrogant wife that they could endlessly exploit kindness, manipulate trust, and walk entirely over anyone they deemed financially or socially inferior. They had grown completely accustomed to living a life entirely shielded from the harsh, natural consequences of their own deeply selfish actions. I simply removed that artificial shield. I stopped endlessly absorbing their endless disrespect. When they aggressively tried to push me out into the freezing cold to steal the warm shelter I had built with my own two hands, I simply closed the heavy door and forced them to finally stand in the brutal storm they had intentionally created. This massive conflict was never truly about hoarding corporate wealth or maliciously destroying a marriage. It was fundamentally about fiercely protecting the incredibly sacred memory of my beloved wife, Diane. Diane and I had spent 30 long years pouring our blood, our sweat, and our deepest love into this modest house. We had skipped expensive vacations to pay down the mortgage, and we had endured incredibly long working hours to ensure our family always had a safe, secure sanctuary. Jordan wanted to casually discard that beautiful legacy like a piece of cheap trash just to temporarily fund his foolish, artificially inflated corporate ego. I could absolutely never allow her beautiful memory to be completely erased by his overwhelming greed. Furthermore, I had a fundamental duty to fiercely protect my own inherent dignity as a human being. A man who quietly allows his own child to completely strip away his independence, drain his emergency savings, and actively plot his mental incarceration is a man who has completely given up on his own life. I refused to surrender my sanity or my property simply because they felt extremely entitled to it. I utilized the exact same corporate systems they worshipped to teach them a deeply painful, incredibly profound lesson about fundamental human boundaries. I did not crush them out of malice. I meticulously dismantled their fraudulent empire to completely stop the toxic cycle of endless exploitation. The absolute peace I felt right now, sitting on this quiet porch, was the undeniable direct result of executing that necessary silent correction. I carefully put every single broken boundary back into its proper place, finally restoring the necessary natural order. I opened my eyes and looked out toward the fading horizon. The vibrant blue sky was slowly transforming into a breathtaking canvas of deep orange, rich purple, and vibrant crimson. The sun was beginning its final descent behind the silhouette of the city, casting long, peaceful shadows across my front lawn. This entire journey had taught me an incredibly profound truth about the fundamental nature of human relationships. For decades, I had blindly believed that sharing biological blood automatically guaranteed a lifelong bond of unbreakable loyalty. I was entirely wrong. True family is not determined by shared genetics or a shared last name. True family is defined entirely by mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and the consistent preservation of basic human dignity. Blood simply makes you related, but consistent respect is what actually makes you a family. I lost a deeply greedy, incredibly selfish son to the cold consequences of his own monumental arrogance. He chose to worship the hollow illusion of corporate wealth instead of valuing the quiet, steady love of the father who raised him. I cannot change the terrible choices he made, nor can I instantly erase the profound pain his vicious betrayal originally caused. However, in losing him, I ultimately found my absolute freedom. I am no longer chained to the exhausting toxic cycle of endless financial demands and constant emotional manipulation. I am completely liberated from the heavy burden of trying to forcefully save a man who actively wanted to drown me. I took one final deep breath of the cool evening air. I am Anthony Hayes. I am 69 years old, and I am currently living the most authentic, entirely secure chapter of my entire life. My beloved home is permanently safe. My hard-earned legacy is fully protected and actively serving a beautiful charitable purpose in honor of my wonderful wife. I rested my hand gently on the wooden armrest of the swing. I watched the spectacular sunset slowly fade into a quiet, starry night. I sat there on my porch swing, completely unbothered by the past, utterly untouchable by their desperate greed, and finally at absolute profound peace with the man I have chosen to become today. The silent correction is officially and completely finished now. Fade to black. I also learned that true power never needs to announce itself. Arrogance builds fragile empires on borrowed money and stolen pride, but real wealth is built in silence and sustained by integrity. People like Jordan and Megan mistake kindness for weakness, completely unaware that a quiet man often holds the heaviest hammer. Never let anyone define your worth based on their superficial standards. If my story resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own hidden strength. Leave a comment sharing how you set boundaries with toxic people. Hit subscribe for more stories.